The door opened without knocking. That was the first thing wrong. In the French royal palace, doors did not open without knocking. There were rules for everything. Procedures that had been followed for generations. Rituals that governed who could enter a room, and when, and how. The entire machinery of French court life ran on the understanding that certain boundaries existed and would be respected. But this was during the Fronde, on a winter night in Paris, and the boundaries had stopped working. The boy in the bed was 12 years old. His name was Louis, and he was the King of France. And in the years since his father had died and left him the crown, he had learned that being King of France meant something very different from what he had imagined. He had imagined power. He had been given a title. He had imagined safety. He had been given a target. He lay still. This was a skill he had been developing without anyone teaching him. The ability to make his body into something that did not betray him, to slow his breathing until it resembled sleep, to keep his eyes closed against the light that was now moving across his face. Torchlight held by men who had walked into his bedroom uninvited because they wanted to see if he was really there. They were not assassins. That was the strange thing about this moment. And it was the thing that made it more frightening than an assassination attempt would have been. Assassins wanted something finished. These men just wanted to look. They were members of the French nobility. The great families who had spent the last several years tearing the country apart in a conflict everyone called the Fronde. A word that meant slingshot, a child's weapon. A name that made the whole catastrophe sound smaller than it was. They had their grievances with the crown. They had their demands and their alliances and their arguments about taxation and power and who really ran France when the king was a child who could not run anything himself. What they wanted tonight was proof that the king had not fled, that he was still in Paris, that they still had him. The torchlight moved across his face and held. Louis, King of France, lay in his bed and did not move and did not breathe and did not let his eyelids flutter. He gave them nothing. He was 12 years old, and he had learned in the past several years, through cold rooms and midnight escapes, and the sight of his most powerful protectors being humiliated and driven out, that the world was not what anyone had told him it was, and he had learned something else, something that no one had intended to teach him. He had learned that the only power he reliably possessed was the power to control what people could see. If they could see his fear, they owned him. If they could not see it, he was still the king. The torchlight moved away. The footsteps retreated. The door closed. The boy in the bed opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling in the dark. And somewhere in the distance, Paris was loud, with the sound of a country that had forgotten what it owed him. He did not forget what it owed him. He would never forget. And he would spend the next 72 years of his life making sure that no door would ever open on him like that again. What he built to ensure that would become the most famous palace in the history of the world, what it cost to build it, and what it cost the people who lived inside it and the people who never got anywhere near it, is where this story actually lives. It begins here, in the dark, with a boy pretending to be asleep. 23 years. That is how long Louis XIII and Anne of Austria were married before they had a child who survived. 23 years of a union arranged for diplomatic reasons, and that had never become much more than that. Between a king who was difficult and withdrawn, and a queen who was Spanish by birth and never entirely trusted by the French court, trying to produce an heir in the specific fishbowl of public scrutiny that the French monarchy provided. The pregnancies came, and the pregnancies failed. The court watched, and the court commented, and did what courts always do, which is to take the private suffering of people in public positions and treat it as a matter of legitimate, collective concern. An heir to the throne of France was, in fact, a matter of legitimate collective concern. That did not make the experience of it any less brutal for the two people at the center of it. Then, on September the 5th, 1638, a boy was born. He survived. He was healthy. He had his mother's dark eyes. As the months passed, a quality that people who saw him noticed and found difficult to describe. A presence, an awareness, something that made adults in a room feel that this child was taking in more than a child should be able to take in. They named him Louis, after his father, and they called him Louis Dieudonné. Louis, the God-given. The name was not affection. It was announcement. After 23 years, this child's arrival was being framed as divine intervention, as proof that France was favored, as a sign that the dynasty would continue. He was 4 months old, and he was already carrying the weight of what his existence meant to everyone who was not him. In the fields outside Paris, that same autumn of 1638, farmers who had been paying taxes to fund the 30 Years' War for a decade were watching their harvests and calculating how much would be left after the tax collectors came through. The birth of the Dieudonné, the God-given prince, was celebrated in church announcements and court ceremonies. The farmers paid their taxes and said nothing about either. His father, Louis XIII, was ill in the way that people were ill in the 17th century, which meant that the nature of the illness was understood approximately, and the treatment was often more dangerous than the disease. He had good months and bad months, and then fewer good months, and then mostly bad ones. And through all of it, he looked at his son with the complicated expression of a man who knows he is leaving something unfinished and is not sure the person receiving it is ready. The boy was 4 years old when his father died in May of 1643. He was brought to his father's bedside in the final days. The story that has survived, and that may be exactly what happened, or maybe the kind of thing that gets attached to moments because it feels right, is that Louis XIII asked the boy his name, and the boy said, Louis XIV. Papa. The father was not yet dead, and the son had already become his successor. That is not a metaphor. That is a description of what the French monarchy actually was. A system in which identity was not personal but dynastic, in which who you were was determined entirely by your position, in a line of succession that stretched back centuries and would, in theory, stretch forward indefinitely. Louis did not choose to be Louis XIV. He could not have chosen otherwise. He came into consciousness inside a role that had been prepared for him before he was born. What this meant practically, in the years of childhood that followed his father's death, was a specific kind of loneliness that does not have a good name. He was surrounded always. There were attendants and tutors and courtiers and ladies and guards at every moment of every day. There was never a room he entered alone, or a meal he ate without observers, or a game he played without people watching to see how a future king played games. Privacy, in any meaningful sense, did not exist for him. His mother, Anne of Austria, loved him genuinely and was his closest relationship in those early years. But she was also his regent and therefore his sovereign in the technical sense, and the relationship carried that weight, whether they wanted it to or not. She had spent the first 2 decades of her marriage being watched and suspected, and occasionally accused of treason, treated as a Spanish agent inside the French court rather than as the Queen of France. She had navigated decades of a hostile environment where her foreign birth made her permanently suspect, and she had done it by developing a very specific set of skills. The ability to appear open while revealing nothing important, to be warm in ways that did not expose vulnerability, to move through a court full of people who did not fully trust her while maintaining the composure that her position required. These were not skills she sat down and deliberately taught her son. They were skills she modeled, day after day, in the way she moved through rooms and handled conversations and managed the constant surveillance of court life. Louis watched his mother navigate a world that had never been fully hers and drew conclusions from what he saw. The most important conclusion was this: composure was not a natural state. It was a practice, and the people who maintained it most effectively were the ones who had learned to keep the interior life entirely separate from what the exterior showed. She also gave him Mazarin. Cardinal Jules Mazarin was the most powerful man in France during Louis's childhood. The chief minister, who ran the government in everything but name, while the king was too young to run it himself. He was Italian by birth, charming and brilliant and deeply unpopular, with exactly the people whose cooperation he needed: the French nobility, who resented a foreigner holding the real authority, while a child held the title. What Mazarin taught Louis was not delivered in lessons. It was absorbed through proximity, through years of watching a man who understood power as a practical matter rather than a philosophical one. Observe before acting. Conceal your intentions until acting is unavoidable. Never let anyone see what you actually want until you already have it. These were not comfortable lessons. They were the lessons of survival. And Louis received them the way children receive the most important things they learn. Not through being taught, but through watching how the adults around them navigate the world. And always, in the background, was Paris. The city outside the palace was not the city that celebrated him. It was a city that had its own ideas about how France should be run, its own grievances, its own voices that did not lower themselves when talking about the king the way the people inside the palace were required to. The wars of Louis XIII had been paid for by taxation that fell most heavily on the people least able to pay it. The peasants and the workers and the merchants of ordinary Paris carried the cost of a foreign policy they had no voice in shaping. This is not a detail that appeared in Louis's formal education. The model of kingship he absorbed placed the king at the center of the nation, the way the sun is at the center of the solar system, not as a member of a community with responsibilities to the other members, but as the source from which everything radiated, the fixed point around which everything else moved. The people outside the palace were part of France. They were not, in this model, people the king was accountable to. That understanding, absorbed so early that it became invisible, would shape everything that followed. Louis was growing. He was watching. He was learning. And Paris, outside the palace walls, was learning things too. The first time they ran, no one told him why. It was January of 1649, and Louis was 10 years old. And one moment he was in his bed in the Palais Royal, and the next moment there were hands pulling him upright, and voices speaking in the urgent, low registers that adults use when they are frightened, but do not want a child to know. They are frightened. He was dressed quickly, in the dark, in clothes that were not his usual clothes, because there was no time for his usual clothes. His mother was there. Mazarin was there. And then they were moving through corridors and downstairs and out into a January night that was cold in the specific way that Paris is cold in January, which is a cold that comes up from the stones and gets into everything. They left in carriages, without ceremony. No procession, no announcement, no ritual that normally preceded any movement of the royal household. They simply left, slipping out of the capital in the darkness while the city slept. Because if Paris had known they were going, Paris might have tried to stop them. They went to Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a palace outside the city, and what they found when they arrived was not what a royal household expected to find. The rooms had not been prepared. There were not enough beds. There were not enough blankets. It was the middle of winter, and the fireplaces were cold, and the child, who was the King of France, lay down that first night under coverings that were not warm enough in a room that was not his, and listened to the sounds of a place that did not know he was coming. He had imagined power. He had been given a title. He had imagined safety. He had been given a target. This is the detail that Louis carried with him for the rest of his life. Not the grand political narrative of the Fronde, not the constitutional arguments about taxation and the rights of the parliaments and the power of the nobility, but the physical memory of being cold, of being a king without adequate blankets, of understanding in his body, before he understood it anywhere else, that the title and the reality were two different things, and that the gap between them could open without warning in the middle of the night. The Fronde was not one event. It was a series of overlapping crises that ran from 1648 to 1653. 5 years during which France came as close to tearing itself apart as it would come until the Revolution, a century and a half later. There were multiple factions with incompatible grievances. The parliaments wanted limits on the crown's power to tax without oversight. The great nobles wanted to reverse the centralization that Richelieu and then Mazarin had been pursuing, to restore the feudal independence that the monarchy had been systematically dismantling. The city of Paris had its own fury, fueled by years of war, taxation, and resentment of the foreign cardinal, who seemed to be running everything. What Louis experienced was not the political structure of this. He was 10, then 11, then 12, then 13. He experienced it as a series of images and sensations that burn themselves into memory with the particular intensity of things that happen to children before they have the frameworks to make sense of them. He experienced the cold rooms at Saint-Germain. He experienced the return to Paris months later, when a negotiated settlement temporarily ended the first phase of the conflict, and the way the city looked at the royal procession coming back. The crowd did not cheer the way a king's return should have produced. They watched. They observed. And that watching silence was more unnerving than open hostility would have been. Hostility you could respond to. This silence just measured you. He experienced Mazarin being driven out. Twice. The most powerful man in France. The man who had shaped Louis's understanding of what power was. Forced to leave the country, he ran because the people who hated him had enough combined force to make staying impossible. Twice. Mazarin packed his things and crossed the border. And twice Louis watched him go. The lesson was not that Mazarin was weak. The lesson was that no position was permanently secure, that the ground could shift under anyone. He experienced the winter night when members of the nobility came to the Palais Royal, walked into his bedroom, and held a torch over his face to verify he was there. The scene from the prologue. Now, in its full context, they were not there to harm him. They were there to inventory him, to confirm that the asset was still in place. He lay in his bed, and he did not move, and he did not open his eyes, and he gave them nothing. And when they left, he stared at the ceiling and understood something that would take him years to fully articulate, but that he felt completely in that moment. They had come into his room. They had stood over his bed. They had held a torch to his face. And the only power he had possessed in that moment was the power to deny them the satisfaction of knowing he was awake. Control what they can see. That was all he had. So that was what he would build on. The second phase of the Fronde. The noble uprising, led by the Prince of Condé, was in some ways more dangerous than the first. because it involved actual armies maneuvering across France and the very real possibility of something that looked like civil war. Louis was 12 and 13 during these years, old enough to understand more of what was happening, and what he understood was this: the men who were supposed to be the natural defenders of the French crown were the ones trying to dismantle it. The great families, the ancient names, the people whose rank and privilege depended entirely on the existence and legitimacy of the monarchy, were the ones with armies in the field against the king. He filed this away. He was very good at filing things away. There was a battle at the Faubourg Saint-Antoine in July of 1652, fought in the streets outside Paris, and Louis watched part of it from a hill outside the city. He was 13 years old, watching Frenchmen kill Frenchmen in the streets of his capital. He would describe it to courtiers decades later, always with the same flatness, the same careful removal of visible emotion, as if he had learned to talk about it by watching someone else's memory rather than his own. In the towns around Paris during these years, ordinary families were paying the cost of a civil war that had nothing to do with their grievances and everything to do with the grievances of people far above them. Merchants could not move goods through roads controlled by competing armies. Harvests sat unharvested because the men who harvested them had been pressed into service by one faction or another. The Fronde was a political crisis for the nobility and a survival crisis for everyone else. The Fronde ended not with a dramatic resolution, but with a gradual exhaustion. The factions ran out of money and momentum, and the shared grievance that had held them together dissolved into individual interests that were incompatible with each other. Condé eventually fled to Spain. The parliaments made their peace with the crown. Paris opened its gates, and Louis rode back into Paris in October of 1652, 15 years old, on horseback, in a procession that was this time, given the celebration that had been absent on his previous return. The crowds that came out to watch were large. There was cheering. There were people who had spent the past several years making his life dangerous and uncertain, now standing on the streets of his capital, clapping their hands because he had come back. He looked at them. He smiled the smile that a king was supposed to smile on an occasion like this. And somewhere behind the smile, in the part of himself that he was learning to keep separate from what other people could see, he was taking notes. They would cheer for anyone who was in front of them right now. They had no particular loyalty to him. They had no memory. Or if they had memory, they had decided the memory was not important. They were a crowd. And a crowd was not a person and did not behave like a person. What he had learned about crowds during the past 5 years was that they were not something you trusted. They were something you managed. Mazarin came back too. The peace held. The government resumed the business of governing. Louis returned to his education and his daily routines and the various ceremonies and rituals that structured life at the French court. But something had changed in him that would not change back. The boy who had been pulled from his bed in the middle of a January night 3 years earlier and driven out of his own capital had come back with information that no tutor had given him and no book contained. He knew what the ground felt like when it shifted. He knew what it felt like to have power as a concept without power as a reality. He knew what it meant to lie in a cold room under inadequate blankets and understand that the title above your name was only as solid as the people around you were willing to make it. He would spend the rest of his life making sure the ground never shifted again. He would build something that made shifting impossible, or as close to impossible as human ingenuity could manage. He was 15 years old, and the Fronde was over, and the education that actually mattered had just been completed. Everything else he learned would be in service of what the Fronde had taught him. Mazarin came back to France in February of 1653 and did not pretend that his absence had been anything other than what it was. He had been driven out by people who hated him, had spent months in exile managing the situation from a distance, with the particular skill of a man who understood that physical absence from power did not have to mean the end of power, and had returned when the political conditions shifted enough to make return possible. He moved back into his role as chief minister, as if he had simply stepped out of the room for a moment, with the composure of someone who had decided that dignity was a performance rather than a condition, and that the performance could be resumed at will. Louis watched this. He was 14 years old, and he watched everything. The relationship between Louis and Mazarin is one of the more unusual ones in the history of statecraft, because it was simultaneously a genuine mentorship and a complicated negotiation. Mazarin was not Louis's father, and did not try to be. He was also not simply a servant or an employee, though technically that was what he was. He was something closer to what we might now call a sponsor, a person of enormous capability and cunning, who had aligned his interests with Louis's interests, and who was investing in the young king's development, because a capable king was the most useful thing Mazarin could have standing. Behind him, what he taught, he mostly taught by doing. Louis was brought into council meetings from an early age, seated at the table, expected to observe. He was not asked for his opinions. He was not there to participate. He was there to watch how Mazarin read the men across the table, how he adjusted his approach in real time based on information he was gathering from their expressions and their pauses and the specific ways they chose their words. He was there to see that power in a room was not always held by the person who spoke most or loudest, that sometimes the most significant thing happening was in the silences between the words. Mazarin himself was not a physically imposing man. He did not fill rooms with his presence the way some leaders do, through sheer force of personality or size. What he had instead was a quality of attention, a way of making the person he was talking to feel that they had his complete focus, that their concerns were his concerns, that whatever they needed was the thing he most wanted to provide. It was a form of performance so skilled that most people who experienced it did not recognize it as performance. They experienced it as genuine care and left the conversation feeling understood. The performance was not entirely false. Mazarin did care about France, about the crown, about the project of building a centralized and powerful French state, and about Louis himself, in the complicated way that teachers care about students they have invested in significantly. But the care was always in service of something. The thing that Mazarin taught Louis, through years of watching this in practice, was that effective power was almost always in service of something beyond itself, and that the people who used power most skillfully were the ones who understood what they were actually trying to accomplish, and never confused the instrument with the goal. Anne of Austria was the other education. She is the figure in Louis's early life who most often gets compressed into a single characteristic. The devoted mother, who also happened to be regent, and the compression does her a disservice. She was a more complicated person than that. She had spent the first 2 decades of her marriage being watched, suspected, occasionally accused of treason, and treated as a Spanish agent inside the French court, rather than as the Queen of France. Her correspondence had been intercepted. Her friendships had been monitored. She had navigated decades of a hostile environment where her foreign birth made her permanently suspect. And she had done it by developing a very specific set of skills, the ability to appear open while revealing nothing important, to be warm in ways that did not expose vulnerability, to move through a court full of people who did not fully trust her, while maintaining the composure that her position required. Louis watched his mother navigate a world that had never been fully hers and drew conclusions from what he saw. The most important conclusion was this: composure was not a natural state. It was a practice. It required constant maintenance, and the people who maintained it most effectively were the ones who had learned to keep the interior life entirely separate from what the exterior showed. His interior life, during these years, was not simple. He was a young man of considerable intelligence, who was not being asked to use his intelligence in any significant way, because the world he inhabited was not yet willing to treat him as a full participant in his own governance. He sat in council meetings and watched. He attended ceremonies and performed his role in them. He received tutors and absorbed what they had to offer. Though his formal education was uneven, strong in some areas and neglected in others, what he had instead of a systematic plan was time. Time to observe, time to accumulate impressions and sort them and file them in the part of himself that was always running, always processing, always taking note of what worked and what did not, and who could be trusted and who could not, and why the people around him made the choices they made. And always, in everything, the question of when, Mazarin was still in place. Mazarin was still running the government, still making the decisions that shaped France's direction, still the person that foreign ambassadors negotiated with and that French ministers deferred to. Louis was the king in name and in ceremony. Mazarin was the king in practice. Both of them understood this. Neither of them said it directly. And Louis waited. Patience was not passivity. It was preparation. Every year he had spent watching and waiting and filing things away had been a year of accumulating the knowledge and the clarity and the absolutely settled sense of purpose that he would need when the moment came. Mazarin fell ill in the winter of 1660 and 61. It was a slow decline, the kind that gives everyone involved time to understand what is happening and no ability to change it. Louis visited him. He sat by the bedside of the man who had taught him what power was and watched him fail. What he felt in those visits was complex in ways that did not include simple grief. There was something that might have been genuine feeling for a man who had been central to his life. There was also something that was very much like readiness. The door was about to open. He had been standing outside it for 22 years. Mazarin died on March the 9th, 1661. The next morning, Louis called a meeting of the council. The ministers arrived, expecting to be told who the next chief minister would be. The King of France had always had a chief minister. It was how things worked. There would be a transition, a period of adjustment, and then a new Mazarin would emerge, and the machinery of government would continue to operate as it always had. Louis looked at the men assembled before him and told them something different. There would be no new chief minister. He would be governing France himself, directly, without an intermediary. When they needed to know what the king wanted, they would ask the king. When they had decisions that required royal authority, they would bring them to him personally. The line of authority now ran directly from them to Louis, and from Louis to no one above him. Because there was no one above him. He was 22 years old. He had been patient for 22 years. He was done being patient. The ministers looked at him and at each other and did not know what to do with this information, which was exactly the position Louis intended them to be in. He had learned from watching Mazarin that uncertainty in other people was a form of leverage, that people who did not know what to expect from you could not position themselves against you effectively, that the moment you became fully predictable was the moment you began to lose. He had also learned something that Mazarin had not quite said in words, but that his entire career demonstrated patience was not passivity. It was preparation. Every year he had spent watching and waiting had been a year of accumulating what he would need when the moment came. The moment had come. He was 22 years old, and he had just, quietly and without drama, taken the most powerful country in Europe into his own hands. Now he needed something to do with it. 3 weeks after Mazarin died, Louis invited Nicolas Fouquet to dinner. This was not unusual. Fouquet was the superintendent of finances for France, one of the most powerful men in the country, a person of enormous wealth and considerable taste who had spent years accumulating both the money and the connections that made him, in the estimation of most people who thought about these things, the most likely candidate to become the next Mazarin. He was charming. He was cultured. He had a network of artists and writers and intellectuals who depended on his patronage and who repaid it with loyalty and admiration. He was, by almost any measure, exactly the kind of man who should have been running France. He had also, over the years, been running certain portions of France's finances in ways that benefited Nicolas Fouquet considerably. And Louis knew this. And Fouquet did not know that Louis knew it. And this asymmetry of information was one of the things Louis was thinking about on the evening of August the 17th, 1661, when he arrived at Vaux-le-Vicomte for the most spectacular party that anyone in France could remember attending. What Fouquet had built at Vaux-le-Vicomte was not a house. It was a statement. The chateau rose out of the French countryside with the particular confidence of a structure designed by people who were told that cost was not a consideration and who had taken that instruction seriously. The gardens extended in every direction with a mathematical precision that made the natural landscape feel like it had always been waiting for someone to organize it properly. The fountains worked. The fountains always worked at Vaux-le-Vicomte, because Fouquet had hired the best hydraulic engineers in France to make sure they did. 6,000 guests. Fireworks that turned the summer sky into something that people who saw it would describe for the rest of their lives. Food prepared by chefs operating at a level of sophistication that had no real precedent. The playwright Molière performed a piece written specifically for the evening. The composer, Lully, provided the music. Louis walked through it all and said the appropriate things and smiled the smile of a king who was enjoying himself. And behind the smile, he was very still in the way that he had learned to be very still when he was receiving information that he intended to use. He was not angry. That is the thing that people often get wrong about this evening, imposing a simpler emotional logic on it than the situation actually contained. He was not a young man furious that his servant had outshone him. He was something more controlled than that, and more dangerous. He was a young king who had spent 22 years learning to read rooms. And what this room was telling him was something he needed to hear clearly before he decided what to do with it. What it was telling him was that Fouquet had understood power as something that could be accumulated personally, through wealth and patronage and the cultivation of loyalty to himself rather than to the crown. Fouquet's network, the artists and writers and officials who owed him their positions and their livelihoods, was a parallel structure to the one that was supposed to exist around the king. When people in France thought about who mattered, who could help them, who had the connections and the resources to make things happen, a significant number of them thought of Fouquet before they thought of Louis. This was the problem. Not the party, not the fountains, not the 6,000 guests, or the fireworks, or the fact that the chateau was more beautiful than anything Louis currently owned. The problem was that France had developed a center of gravity that was not the king. Louis had also. In the weeks before the party, read through Fouquet's private correspondence, letters that revealed not only financial irregularities, but the full extent of a network that Fouquet had built with himself at the middle of it. He had seen what it looked like when someone else occupied the position that he intended to occupy. He had also seen the fortifications that Fouquet had been quietly building at Belle Isle, the island off the Breton coast that he owned. Fortifications that had no obvious purpose, if Fouquet was simply a loyal minister of the crown. Louis spent 3 weeks after the party in the particular kind of quiet that preceded his decisions. He spoke to Colbert, who had been providing him with information about Fouquet's finances for months, and whose information was accurate. He considered the legal mechanisms available. He considered the timing. On September the 5th, 1661, his 23rd birthday, the captain of his musketeers arrested Nicolas Fouquet at Nantes. The trial that followed lasted 3 years and produced a result that was, in the strict legal sense, complicated. The court found Fouquet guilty of financial misconduct, but not of treason, and sentenced him to exile rather than death. Louis, exercising his royal authority, changed the sentence to life imprisonment. Fouquet spent the rest of his life in the fortress of Pignerol, in the Alps, and died there 17 years later. The men Fouquet had employed, the architects and landscape designers and artists and craftsmen who had built Vaux-le-Vicomte and filled it with the most sophisticated decorative program in France, did not spend much time unemployed. Louis hired them. The architect, Le Vaux, the landscape designer, Le Notre, the painter and decorator, Le Brun, the entire team that had created the most beautiful private estate in France was redirected toward a project that would make Vaux-le-Vicomte look like a preliminary sketch. The project was in a town called Versailles, 17 miles southwest of Paris. Louis's father had built a small hunting lodge there decades earlier. Louis had been visiting it since childhood. He had been thinking about what it could become for longer than most people knew. What he was building was not yet fully formed in his mind in the early 1660s. It accumulated its ambition gradually, each phase of construction revealing what the next phase needed to be. The scale expanding as his vision of what he required expanded. But the basic principle was clear from the beginning, and it came directly from everything that the Fronde and Mazarin and Fouquet's party had taught him. Power that was distributed was power that could be used against you. Power that was concentrated was power that you controlled. The question was how you concentrated it without simply seizing it through force, because force produced resistance, and resistance produced Frondes, and Frondes produced cold rooms in January with not enough blankets. The answer was more elegant than force. The answer was to make everyone who mattered in France want to be in the same place, to make that place the only location where the things they wanted were available, and to make him the only person who could provide those things. You did not chain people to the center. You made the center the only place worth being. And then you let them chain themselves. Versailles would be the center. He was 23 years old. He had watched and waited and learned and filed things away for 22 years. He had just demonstrated, through the swift and total destruction of the most powerful man in France, that the waiting was over. France had a king now, not a title, not a child in a bed pretending to sleep. A king. The question of what that would cost the people who did not get to be him had not yet fully presented itself. It would. It always does. But in 1661, in the early months of a reign that would last another 54 years, the cost was still abstract, still theoretical, still something that existed in the future rather than in the present. In the present, there was a chateau in Versailles that needed to become a palace. There was a country that needed to understand what kind of king it now had. And there was a young man who had spent his entire conscious life learning how to be exactly this, who was finally, completely, without qualification or intermediary, or the patient endurance of someone else's timeline, in a position to begin. He began. He started dancing before he could govern. This is not a small detail. In the court of mid-17th century France, ballet was not entertainment in the way that word implies now. Something peripheral, something you did for pleasure in the hours when the real work was finished. It was political communication delivered through the body, a language that everyone who mattered understood, and that said things about hierarchy and power and the natural order of the universe that prose could not say as efficiently or as beautifully. Louis danced in his first court ballet at the age of 12. He continued dancing in increasingly elaborate productions for the next 2 decades. He was, by all accounts, genuinely skilled. And the skill mattered because it meant that when he chose the roles he chose, he inhabited them convincingly. He did not look like a king pretending to be a god. He looked like a god who happened also to be a king, which was the entire point. The role he returned to most often was Apollo. Apollo in the classical tradition was the god of the sun, of light, of reason, of order, of the arts. He was also the god at the center of the system, the fixed point around which the other celestial bodies organized themselves. In 1653, when Louis was 14 years old, he danced the role of the rising sun in a production called the Ballet de la Nuit, a 13-hour spectacle that moved through the night and arrived at dawn, at the moment when Louis himself appeared on stage as the sun rising over a darkened world. The audience understood what they were being shown. They were not watching a ballet. They were being presented with a political argument made in light and movement, a visual claim about the nature of kingship that said, here is the center, here is the source of light and order and reason, and the center is him. What is remarkable about this, looking at it from the distance of centuries, is not that Louis used performance to communicate power. That was not new. What was remarkable was the systematic quality of it, the way that what began as court entertainment became, over the following decades, a comprehensive and coordinated program of image building that operated across every available medium simultaneously and with a consistency of message that we would now, without much metaphorical stretching, call a brand. The sun was everywhere. It was on the gates of Versailles. It was woven into the decorative programs of every room. It appeared in the paintings, the tapestries, the furniture, the metalwork, the imagery of Apollo and the sun and light as a metaphor for royal authority was not incidental decoration. It was the visual language of a political argument being made constantly and through every available channel to anyone who entered the spaces Louis controlled. He understood something that most rulers of his era did not understand as clearly or deploy as systematically in a world without newspapers, in the modern sense, without photography, without any of the mass communication technologies that we now take for granted. What people believed about power depended almost entirely on what they could see. You could not tell people you were powerful in the abstract and have them understand it in their bodies, in the way that actually shaped behavior. You had to show them. You had to create experiences that made the claim of power feel self-evident. that made the alternative seem not just wrong, but literally unimaginable. Before there was social media, he used art. Before there was a PR agency, he used the court. Before there was celebrity culture, he built the machinery that made one person the center of everyone else's attention. Not by demanding attention, but by making attention feel like the natural response to something as obvious and necessary as light. Charles Le Brun, the painter Louis trusted most with this work, understood his assignment perfectly. His paintings of the king do not show a man, they show a concept. The postures are classical, drawn from the vocabulary of ancient sculpture and Renaissance painting, situating Louis within a tradition of heroic and divine representation that stretched back to antiquity. The settings are theatrical. The lighting is arranged to produce effects that have no natural counterpart. Hyacinthe de Rigaud's portrait from 1701 is the one that most people know, the image that has come to define how we picture Louis XIV when we picture him at all. Louis was 62 years old when it was painted and had been managing his image actively for 4 decades. The portrait shows a man in coronation robes, his left hand resting on a staff, his body in a pose that simultaneously conveys relaxation and absolute authority. He is looking directly at you. He is not asking anything of you. He simply exists, in the way that facts exist. And your response to him is the appropriate response to a fact. The legs are often mentioned. Louis had good legs, and the portrait makes sure you know it. The robe swept aside to reveal the kind of calves that a man who has been dancing seriously since childhood develops. In the visual language of 17th century portraiture, the display of the body was a political statement. Physical perfection in the king implied the kind of favor that produced physical perfection. The legs were an argument. He was building something that operated on multiple levels at once. On the most immediate level, he was creating images and spaces and ceremonies that made individual people feel the appropriate response to his presence. On a broader level, he was constructing a version of France, a picture of what France was and what it meant and who was at its center, that would circulate through Europe and shape how every court on the continent thought about Louis and about France. On the deepest level, he was doing something that no one had quite done in the same way before he was treating his own identity as a construction project. Understanding that who he was as a public figure was not given but made, and taking that making seriously as a form of governance. There is a question that runs underneath all of this, and it is a question that Louis himself may not have been able to answer cleanly. When you spend enough time performing a version of yourself, when the performance becomes skilled enough and sustained enough and encompassing enough that there are entire decades during which you are never not performing, what happens to the person underneath? He danced Apollo for the last time in 1670. When he was 31 years old, by then Versailles was under serious construction, and the machinery of image production was running at full capacity, and the performance had expanded far beyond the stage into every waking hour of his existence. He retired from dancing without much ceremony, and the court did not comment on this directly, because commenting on what the king chose to do or not do was not something the court did directly. He did not need to dance anymore. He had built the stage large enough that simply existing on it was sufficient. Outside the palace, in the towns and villages of France, the image traveled in fragments. A tapestry in a church, a medal distributed after a military victory, a printed image in a pamphlet, a description passed from person to person, each retelling, adding something and losing something, until the Louis that ordinary French people knew was a composite of received impressions rather than any direct experience. This was also by design. The king you saw from a distance was larger than the king you might meet in a room. The myth was more powerful than the man could ever be. Louis understood this and protected the distance deliberately. The people outside the palace gates were paying for all of it. The tapestries and the paintings and the construction and the ballets and the medals and the elaborate machinery of image production were not free. And the money came from somewhere. And the somewhere was the taxation that fell most heavily on the people who would never see the inside of Versailles and never stand in the Hall of Mirrors and never know what it felt like to be in the same room as the sun that was supposed to be shining for all of them. They were living in the shadow that the light produced. They did not have a word for this yet, but that was still a long way off. In the 1660s and 1670s, the myth was new and still acquiring its full power, and the man at the center of it was young and capable and genuinely formidable in ways that the myth was not lying about, only amplifying. He had turned fear into purpose. He had turned observation into strategy. He had turned a childhood of cold rooms and midnight escapes into a theory of power that was now being executed on the largest scale that the century could accommodate. The sun was rising, and everyone in France was being asked, in one way or another, to arrange themselves in relation to its light. Jean-Baptiste Colbert did not look like a man who changed the world. He was compact and dark, and not particularly charming in the way that the French court measured charm, which was a very specific measurement involving wit and ease, and the ability to make people feel delighted by your presence. Colbert did not delight people. He impressed them, which is a different thing. And sometimes he frightened them, which is a different thing still. He had a quality of concentrated attention that made conversations with him feel like inspections, as if he were cataloguing everything you said and filing it somewhere for future reference. He was, in this way, very much like his king. Louis had identified Colbert years before Mazarin's death, had watched him operate in the cardinal's household and understood what he was seeing. Colbert was the kind of man who built systems. He did not want individual victories. He wanted structures that kept producing victories without requiring his constant intervention. He thought in decades rather than seasons, and in institutions rather than episodes. And this made him almost uniquely suited to the project that Louis was beginning to assemble. In the first years of Louis's personal rule, Colbert was everywhere. He took over the finances after Fouquet's arrest and began the work of understanding what the French state actually possessed and what it actually owed. A project that produced findings that would have been alarming to anyone who had not already suspected that the answer was going to be alarming. France was rich in potential and poor in organization. The tax system was a historical accumulation of competing obligations and exemptions and privileges that had grown up over centuries without any coherent logic, producing a structure in which the people most able to pay taxes were systematically exempted from paying them, and the people least able to pay them bore the majority of the burden. Colbert believed that this was wrong, not primarily on moral grounds, though he was not without moral views, but on practical ones. A France in which the productive classes were taxed into exhaustion was a France that would keep running out of money, no matter how many wars it won or how much territory it acquired. He wanted to change the underlying structure, to build an economy that generated wealth rather than simply extracting it, so that the revenues available to the crown would grow from a growing base rather than declining, as the same base was squeezed progressively harder. He built the French merchant marine. He established manufacturing industries, the production of luxury goods, in particular silk and tapestries and mirrors and the decorative objects that the rest of Europe wanted to buy from France, creating employment and generating exports, and making France's cultural dominance financially productive rather than simply prestigious. He reformed the legal codes that governed commerce. He improved the roads and the canals that moved goods from where they were made to where they could be sold. He also wrote Louis letters, many letters, over many years, about the condition of France and the costs of various royal projects, and the gap between what the crown was spending and what the economy could sustain. The letters were respectful in their form, as all communications with Louis were required to be, but they were direct in their substance, in a way that required either courage or very good positioning. Because telling Louis XIV things he did not want to hear was not a career-enhancing activity. Here is the tension at the center of Colbert's life and work. He was building a France that was genuinely, structurally wealthier, creating the industrial and commercial foundations that would make the country powerful in ways that outlasted any individual military victory. And, simultaneously, the king he served was spending the proceeds of this wealth building faster than the wealth could be built. On Versailles, on Vase, on the ceremonies and the paintings and the tapestries and the elaborate machinery of royal display that ate money in quantities that Colbert tracked, with the precision of a man watching something he cared about being slowly consumed. In the workshops of Lyon during these years, men and women who worked the silk looms worked long hours for wages that were often barely sufficient. They were part of the machine that produced French magnificence. A woman at a loom in Lyon in 1670 might spend her days weaving fabric that would become the upholstery in a room somewhere in Versailles that she would never see. Her wages were what her wages were. What she made would travel to the palace and be admired, and the admiration would circle back eventually as a kind of national pride in French excellence, in the superiority of French craft and French taste. And whether this national pride translated into anything material in her life depended on factors that the pride itself did not address. She was part of the argument Versailles was making. She was one of the people who made it possible for the argument to be made. She was not in the room. The man who flanked Colbert most significantly in the machinery of Louis's state was François Michel Letellier, the Marquis of Louvois, who ran the military. He had inherited the war ministry from his father and expanded it into something that had not existed before in quite the same form. A professionalized, centralized, systematically organized military apparatus that treated the raising and supplying and moving of armies as administrative problems to be solved rather than feudal obligations to be honored. The French army under Louvois became the largest and most effective in Europe, not primarily because of brilliant generalship, but because of logistics. Because someone had thought carefully about how you fed 100,000 men in the field and how you got ammunition to where it needed to be. Louvois was not a gentle man. He had a reputation for ruthlessness that was not unearned. His relationship with Louis was different from Colbert's, more direct, more comfortable with the martial dimensions of royal ambition, more willing to encourage the wars that Colbert's letters were quietly warning against. Where Colbert thought in trade balances, Louvois thought in campaigns. Where Colbert saw a cost, Louvois saw a strategic opportunity. Then there was Sébastien Le Prestre, the Vauban, and Vauban requires separate attention because he was a different kind of person from either of them. And what happened to him says something important about the system Louis had built. Vauban was a military engineer, the greatest of his era and possibly of any era, a man who had spent his career designing the fortifications that protected France's expanding borders, and then, designing the siege works that broke the fortifications protecting everyone else's. He was brilliant at his work in the way that people are brilliant when they have found the exact intersection of their natural gifts and their deepest interest. And he served Louis with a loyalty that was genuine and not merely professional. He was also, over the course of his long career, watching France from the roads and the fields, and the provincial towns where his engineering projects took him, in a way that Colbert and Louvois and Louis himself were not watching it. He saw the people outside Versailles. He talked to the officials who governed them and observed the conditions they described. And what he saw accumulated over decades into a picture very different from the one visible from the Hall of Mirrors. He put it into a document in 1707. He called it a proposal for a royal tithe, and what it proposed was a fundamental reform of the French tax system, a replacement of the existing tangle of obligations and exemptions with a single tax that would apply to everyone, including the nobility and the clergy who were currently exempt, at a rate that the poorest French people could actually pay without being destroyed by the paying. The document was also a description of what was happening to those poorest people. He wrote that 1/10 of the French population was reduced to beggary. He wrote that another significant portion was on the edge. He wrote that the tax burden on the productive classes had reached levels that were damaging the base that generated the revenues being demanded. He was right about all of it. Louis read the document and suppressed it. He relieved Vauban of his positions and his honors, not with cruelty, but with the firm administrative certainty of a man who understood that allowing this document to circulate would raise questions he was not prepared to answer. Vauban died a few months later. The man who had built the walls that protected France was discarded for pointing out what was happening inside those walls. Colbert died in 1683, worn through by decades of work and by the particular exhaustion of a man who has given everything to a project that is not going exactly the way he intended. The story that circulated after his death, which captures something true about the situation, whether or not every detail is exact, was that he did not want Louis to visit him in his final days. He could not bear to look at him. This is either a story about personal disillusionment or about something more dignified than that, about a man who understood that his presence at the deathbed of his life's work would not produce any resolution he could live with, and who chose absence over a conversation that could not go anywhere useful. The machine kept running. It always kept running. It was built to keep running, and the people who had built it, the ones who understood both its power and its cost, were gone, replaced by others who understood the power well enough and the cost not quite well enough. And the difference would matter eventually, in ways that none of them would live to see. But that was still a long way off. In the meantime, there was a palace to fill with light. The low, wet land came first, before the marble and the gold and the 357 mirrors and the fountains that required an engineering project of staggering complexity to keep functioning, before the gardens that stretched to the horizon in their geometric perfection, and the apartments that could house an entire court, and the chapel that made clear whose authority in France came immediately after God's. Before any of it, there was difficult, waterlogged ground on the outskirts of a small town southwest of Paris. Louis's father had built a hunting lodge at Versailles in the 1620s, a modest structure in the countryside, surrounded by the kind of terrain that is productive for hunting precisely because it is not productive for much else. The lodge was comfortable and unpretentious and entirely adequate for a king who wanted somewhere to hunt without the full machinery of the court following him everywhere. Louis XIV began visiting Versailles as a child and kept visiting as he grew. He liked it in ways that were not entirely explicable through practical advantages. though it did offer practical advantages. It was outside Paris, which mattered to him in ways that deepened over time, as the memories of what Paris had done during the Fronde accumulated into a settled conviction that Paris was not a city to be trusted with the physical presence of the king. It was land he could shape in a way that the existing royal palaces were not, carrying as they did the accumulated decisions of previous reigns. But there was something else. He wanted, as an adult and as a king, the thing that the Fronde had taken from him, an environment that he controlled completely, where the ground would not shift, where nothing could happen that he had not anticipated and prepared for and built systems to manage. Paris was chaotic and dense and full of people with their own agendas and energies that could not be fully directed or predicted. Versailles, on land he controlled in the countryside, could be made into something different. He could make it into a world. Construction began seriously in the early 1660s and did not stop for decades. The scale of what was undertaken expanded continuously as the ambition grew to match it. The hunting lodge was absorbed and then exceeded, and then surrounded by wings and courtyards and gardens that pushed the original structure to the center of something vastly larger than anything it had been designed to anchor. The human cost of this construction is not the part of the story that the palace itself tells. The workers who drained the low ground and moved the earth and laid the foundations and built the walls numbered in the tens of thousands during the peak construction years. They came from across France, drawn by wages that were real if not generous. And they worked in conditions that were dangerous in ways that were accepted as the normal background of such work. People died. The records are incomplete in the way that records of the deaths of ordinary people in the 17th century are generally incomplete. Not through deliberate concealment, but through the indifference of a record-keeping system that did not consider the deaths of workers to be information worth preserving. In the same way, it preserved the decisions of ministers and the movements of kings. The waterlogged ground itself was a particular problem. Draining it produced the foundation that the palace required, but it also produced conditions that generated disease. And the workers who lived and labored in those conditions during the construction years paid a price for it that the fountains they were building would never acknowledge. What rose from that ground was, and there is no useful purpose in denying this, astonishing. The gardens designed by André Lenôtre operated on a scale that had no precedent in French landscape design, perhaps in any landscape design. They stretched south and west from the palace in a composition of such geometric precision that the word garden does not quite capture it. Lenôtre's work at Versailles was something else entirely. A landscape reimagined as a demonstration of what it looked like when human reason and human will imposed themselves on nature completely, when nature was not permitted to be irregular or accidental, but was required to conform to a plan. The canal, at the center of the composition, stretched for a mile. The fountains, hundreds of them, required a hydraulic system of such sophistication that Louis employed engineers for decades trying to solve the problem of getting enough water to all of them simultaneously. A problem that was never entirely solved. When Louis walked through his gardens, a team of workers moved ahead of him, turning on the fountains in the sections he was about to enter, and behind him, turning off the ones he had passed, creating the impression of an abundance that could not actually be sustained continuously. The impression was the point. The impression was always the point. Inside the palace, the system that Versailles was actually designed to operate became fully visible. And the system was not about beauty, though it was beautiful, and it was not about comfort, though it was comfortable by the standards of the time. The system was about control, and understanding it requires understanding what Louis had learned from the Fronde about where the danger actually came from. The danger had come from the great nobility. The ancient families with their lands and their armies and their regional power bases and their historical sense of entitlement to participate in governance. These were the people who had driven him out of Paris as a child, who had fielded armies against the crown, who had demonstrated that the diffuse power of the aristocracy was a standing threat to the centralized power of the monarchy. Louis did not destroy the nobility. That was not available to him as an option. And even if it had been, it would not have been strategically sound. What he did instead was something more elegant and in the long run more effective. He made them need him more than he needed them. The mechanism was Versailles. The court that Louis established there was not merely his household. It was, over the course of the 1670s and 1680s, made into the only place in France where the things that the nobility most valued were available: pension, military commands, appointments to prestigious positions, the marriages of children into advantageous alliances, the granting of monopolies and licenses, and the 100 other forms of royal favor that could make a family's fortune or preserve it against decline. All of these flowed from the king, and the king distributed them at Versailles. And therefore the people who needed these things needed to be at Versailles to receive them. The arithmetic was simple, and its implications were profound. A duke who stayed on his estates might have his ancestral lands and his regional prestige, but he was not present when the positions were filled and the favors were granted. And absence meant invisibility. And invisibility in the world Louis was building meant irrelevance. The choice, for any family that wanted to maintain or improve its position, was between Versailles and decline. They came in the thousands, the great and the middling and the aspiring, and they brought their households and their servants and their ambitions and their debts, because maintaining the kind of establishment that Versailles required was extraordinarily expensive, and many of the families most anxious to be present were families that could least afford the cost of the presence. They borrowed money to maintain apartments at Versailles, to dress in the manner that court life required, to participate in the gambling that was one of the principal social activities of the palace, to give the gifts and host the entertainments that participation in the social life of the court demanded. They were spending themselves into dependence, and the dependence was the point. A nobleman who owed money and whose position depended entirely on continued royal favor was not a nobleman who was going to field an army against the crown. He was a nobleman who was going to make sure he was seen at the right ceremonies, and that the king noticed him, and that his conduct gave no offense, and that his family's connections to the patronage network remained intact. He was going to be, in the most practical possible sense, domesticated. The ceremonies that structured life at Versailles were the mechanism through which all of this was administered daily. The lever, the morning rising ceremony, during which the king was dressed by a series of officials, each with a specific role, each role conferring a specific degree of honor and access. The coucher, the going to bed ceremony, which mirrored it, the meals eaten in public, which were not meals in the ordinary sense, but performances of royal abundance that the court observed as audience members. Every ceremony was also a sorting mechanism. Who was present and who was not? Who stood where in the room? Who held what? Who was acknowledged and who was passed over? The attention of the king was the currency of the system, and every ceremony was an opportunity for that currency to be distributed or withheld. And everyone in the court spent their days calculating their position in the distribution and adjusting their behavior accordingly. A man who had come to Versailles with lands and tenants and a medieval sense of his own independent significance would find himself, within a season or two, spending an enormous amount of cognitive energy on the question of whether the king had noticed him this morning, whether the glance had been warmer than yesterday's, whether the slight variation in the angle of the royal nod meant something, or was simply the slight variation that occurred when a man nodded thousands of times a year at thousands of different people. This is what Louis had replaced the threat of feudal independence with. Not chains, not dungeons, not the direct application of royal force. He had replaced it with a game that everyone with ambition could not afford not to play. And the rules of the game required the players to care, deeply and continuously, about the king's good opinion of them. Nobody forced them to come. That was the elegant brutality of it. They came because they wanted to, because the alternatives were worse, because the system had been designed so that the rational choice for anyone who wanted to participate in French public life was to participate on Louis's terms and in Louis's space and in the continuous presence of Louis's judgment. The walls of Versailles did not keep people in. They kept everything that mattered concentrated in one place, under one gaze, oriented toward one center. In the villages of France, the men and women who paid the taxes that funded all of this continued their lives in the way that people whose lives are not being recorded mostly continue their lives, with the ordinary difficulty of ordinary existence, which, in the France of the 1670s and 1680s, included the difficulty of paying taxes designed around the needs of a state that had chosen to express itself through the most expensive building project in the history of Laissa, the country. They could not see the fountains. They could not walk in the gardens. They did not attend the lever or stand in the hall of mirrors or participate in the social arithmetic of a court that was consuming, in its maintenance and its ceremonies and its gambling and its fashion, a sum of money that moved through their hands on its way to Versailles and did not come back. What they had was the knowledge, delivered through various channels, that France had a king of extraordinary magnificence, that the king's magnificence was France's magnificence, that the glory of Versailles reflected on all of them. Whether they found this persuasive depended on how cold it was and how much bread cost and how many of their sons were currently in Louis's armies. The palace stood in its remade ground, and the water in the fountains moved where the engineers directed it, and the gardens were kept in their impossible perfection by the labor of people whose names were not recorded. And at the center of it all, in a bedroom that was literally the geographical center of the building, a man woke up every morning and was dressed by a room full of people who had competed for the privilege of being present. And the world he had made arranged itself around him as he had intended it to arrange itself. He had been cold in a room without enough blankets. He had built this instead. The question of what it cost and who paid was a question that the building had not been designed to ask. The ambassador from Siam arrived at Versailles in September of 1686 and was given, as all important visitors were given, the experience that Louis had designed for exactly this purpose. He was walked through the palace, not quickly, not efficiently, not in the way that you move someone from one room to another when the destination is the point. He was moved through Versailles, the way you move someone through an argument you want them to find convincing. Room by room, each space building on the last, the scale and the richness and the deliberateness of it accumulating until, by the time he arrived at the place Louis intended him to arrive, he had been prepared for it in the way that a piece of music prepares you for its final movement. The doors of the Galerie des Glaces opened. What the ambassador saw, and what every person who entered that room for the first time saw, was not something that prior experience prepared you for. You could be told about it. You could read descriptions of it. You could have visited every other palace in Europe and arrived with a sophisticated understanding of what wealth and power looked like when they were translated into architecture. None of it was adequate preparation for what happened. When those doors opened and the room was in front of you, the gallery ran for 240 feet along the garden facade of the palace. On one side, 17 arched windows looked out over Le Notre's gardens, and on days when the sun was at the right angle, the light came through them in a way that seemed almost aggressive in its abundance, as if the outside world were being compressed and intensified and directed into the room. On the other side, 17 arched mirrors, each one composed of multiple panels of glass, because the technology of the time could not produce a single piece of glass large enough, reflected everything the windows admitted, doubled it, sent it back across the room to be reflected again, so that the light inside was not the light that had entered, but something transformed by its passage through the mirror world, something brighter and stranger and more absolute than ordinary light. 357 mirrors in total. On the grand ceremonial occasions when the chandeliers and the candelabra were lit and thousands of candles burned at once, the room became something that did not have a natural equivalent, a space where the distinction between the light source and the light had been dissolved, where everything reflected everything else in an infinite recession that made the room feel larger than its dimensions, and the experience of being inside it feel like being inside a demonstration of some principle more fundamental than architecture. Le Brun had painted the ceiling, 30 paintings arranged in a program that told the story of the first 18 years of Louis's personal reign, as a story of achievement that borrowed freely from the vocabulary of the divine, Louis as Jupiter dispensing justice, Louis as the embodiment of French military glory, Louis surrounded by the allegorical figures of victory and fame and the personified nations of Europe, arranged in postures of appropriate subordination. The paintings were not subtle. They were not trying to be subtle. They were an argument stated at maximum volume in the most permanent medium available. And the argument was that the man who had built this room, and whose story covered its ceiling, was not simply a successful king. He was the fulfillment of something. He was what French greatness looked like when it achieved its proper form. The ambassador from Siam stood in this room and understood what he was being shown. He was being shown power. But not power as threat. Not the power of an army, or a fortress, or a demonstration of force that said, "What happens to people who oppose this?" He was being shown power as a cosmological fact, as something so thoroughly woven into the fabric of the world that opposing it would be like opposing the arrangement of the planets. The room did not say you should submit to Louis. It said that submission was the natural response to something as obviously central and necessary as light. This was the sophistication of what Louis had built, and it is the thing that distinguishes it from simple intimidation or simple luxury. Other rulers had treasure. Other courts had beautiful things. What Versailles had, in the Hall of Mirrors, more completely than anywhere else, was a total environment, a space that did not merely display power, but produced a specific experience of it, that used every available variable of light and scale and surface and reflection to create in the person standing inside it a feeling that was not quite like any other feeling. The feeling was of being seen and seeing simultaneously. The mirrors returned your own image to you from every angle, so that you were always aware of yourself as a figure in the composition, as one of the elements in the room's visual argument, and at the same time, you were aware of being observed, not necessarily by a specific person, but by the room itself, by the accumulated gaze of 240 feet of reflective surface that missed nothing. This was intentional. Louis's court was a world in which being seen was the primary social currency, in which visibility meant significance and invisibility meant erasure, in which the management of one's appearance in the eyes of the king and the court was the central activity of public life. The Hall of Mirrors externalized this logic and made it architectural. It built the experience of mutual observation into the walls. You could not stand in that room without understanding, in your body, before you understood it in your mind, what Versailles was and what it required of you. The practical uses of the gallery were significant. It was where the court assembled for the processions to the royal chapel. It was where great diplomatic receptions took place, where Louis received foreign ambassadors in circumstances designed to ensure that their first report home about the French court would convey the appropriate impression of French power. The Siamese ambassadors were one of many such delegations. Ambassadors from the Doge of Venice, from the Holy Roman Emperor, from the kings and princes and republics of Europe and beyond, all made the walk through the palace that ended in this room. All were given the experience that the room was designed to produce. What they reported back shaped how their home courts understood France and understood Louis. They had to report something, because their sovereigns wanted to know what Versailles was. And the only honest answer was an account of an experience that did not translate well into language. The attempts at translation, the letters and dispatches that described the palace and its gallery and the ceremonies that surrounded the king, were exercises in a kind of astonished inadequacy. Writers reaching for comparison and finding that the comparison did not hold, that the thing they had seen was outside the range of what description could capture. This inadequacy was also designed. A palace that could be fully described could be evaluated, compared, placed in a hierarchy with other palaces. A palace that could not be fully described was something else, something that existed in the imagination of everyone who had not seen it as larger than any specific reality could be. The actual building cost money that France could not sustainably afford. This is simply true, and Colbert's letters said so, and Vauban's numbers eventually confirmed it, and the consequences would become visible over the following century in ways that Louis did not live to see and might not have changed his decisions even if he had. A building that exists as a demonstration cannot stop demonstrating without ceasing to be what it is. Versailles could not be made less than it was without destroying the argument it was making. And the argument was the point, outside the windows of the Hall of Mirrors, beyond the gardens and their engineered perfection. The roads went out toward the towns and villages of France, where the people who paid for the candles and the mirrors and the paintings on the ceiling lived their lives at whatever distance from magnificence their circumstances permitted. Rigaud painted the portrait in 1701, when Louis was 62 years old and had been building and maintaining this world for 4 decades. The portrait shows a man who has inhabited a constructed identity for so long that the construction and the person are no longer distinguishable from each other. The posture is absolute. The gaze is without question or uncertainty. The robes and the setting and the arrangement of light all say the same thing that the Hall of Mirrors says, and that the Ballet of the Rising Sun said, and that Versailles itself says, which is that this is what the center looks like, what the portrait does not show, and what the Hall of Mirrors does not show, and what none of the machinery of image production that Louis had built over his lifetime was designed to show, is the man who woke up before the lever and lay in the darkness for a few minutes before the ceremony of the day began. The man who had a body that hurt in ways he would not permit to be discussed. The man who had outlived many of the people he had actually cared about and who knew, in the way that people in their 60s know things about their own mortality, that more would follow. That man did not appear in the mirrors. The mirrors were designed to show only the light. The ambassador from Siam completed his visit and went home and wrote his report. The report said what all the reports said, that there was nothing in the world like it, that the King of France lived in a manner that required new language to describe, that the sight of Versailles made the palaces of other kings look like what they were, which was the residences of men, while Versailles looked like something else. It looked like the sun had decided to build a house, which was exactly what it was supposed to look like. The man inside the house went to bed that night as he went to bed every night, with ceremony and witnesses and the careful management of his final waking moments that the coucher required. The candles were extinguished in the prescribed order. The witnesses withdrew in the prescribed sequence. The room went dark. In the dark. There were no mirrors. In the dark. He was simply a man in a bed, which was something he had been when he was 12 years old, and the Fronde had taught him what the dark contained. He had filled the dark with mirrors. He had built a world that was never dark, that was never without light or without eyes. And still, every night, the candles went out. There was an evening at Versailles in the autumn of 1672 when 3 women were in the same room. They were not introduced to each other that night, not in any formal way that the records would have noted. They moved through the same candlelit space in the way that people at court moved through spaces, with the careful awareness of position and precedence and the specific geometry of social standing that governed where you stood and who you spoke to and what you were allowed to be seen doing with whom. Maria Theresa was there because she was always there. She was the queen, and her presence at court functions was not optional in any meaningful sense. She stood where queens were supposed to stand, spoke to the people queens were supposed to speak to, and maintained the composed expression that she had been maintaining since she arrived in France 12 years earlier, as a young Spanish princess who had been sent to this court to be useful rather than to be happy. Françoise Athénée de Montespan was there because she was at the height of her power, and everyone at Versailles understood that her presence was not incidental. She was Louis's mistress, the most important person at court after the king himself, and she moved through rooms with the specific confidence of someone who knows that the person who matters most in the building is happy when she is present. She was brilliant and beautiful, and she knew it. And the court had adjusted itself around the fact of what she was, the way water adjusts around a stone. Françoise d'Aubigne, who had not yet become the Marquise de Maintenon, was there in a more peripheral capacity, having recently entered royal circles through her role caring for the children that Louis and Montespan had produced together. She was quieter than either of the other women, more watchful, with the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have survived difficult circumstances and learned from the surviving that observation is worth more than display. 3 women in the same room, arranged by the gravity of one man, each of them navigating a world that had been built for his convenience and that offered them, in their different ways, the only forms of significance that world made available. Maria Theresa of Spain had arrived in France in 1660 to marry Louis, and spent the next 23 years being almost entirely overlooked by the history that was being made around her. This is itself a kind of story. She was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain, Louis's first cousin, and their marriage was the diplomatic seal on the Peace of the Pyrenees, the treaty that ended decades of conflict between France and Spain. She brought with her a Spanish household, Spanish habits, a deep Catholic piety that was genuine and uncomplicated in ways that the French court found slightly baffling, and a quality that the court found difficult to catalogue, a kind of settled contentment that did not require the approval of the room to sustain itself. She knew about the other women from very early on. The French court was not a place where such things were kept private, partly because privacy was structurally impossible at Versailles, and partly because the king's romantic interests were considered matters of public concern, which is a strange convention, but one that the court accepted as simply how things were. She said very little about it publicly. She went to mass. She played cards. She maintained the outward form of her position as queen, with a composure that people in the court found either admirable or boring, depending on their own temperament. What she said in private. What she felt in the hours when the court was not watching. What it actually was to be the Queen of France in a court built entirely around the magnetism of your husband. These things are not in the record. She did not leave letters in the way that people who expected their letters to matter sometimes left letters. She was not the kind of person who felt that her inner life required external documentation. When she died in July of 1683, suddenly, and without much warning, Louis was with her. He was reported to have said, in the hours after her death, that she had never caused him grief, but once. The once was this moment, the dying itself, the only thing she had done in 23 years that inconvenienced him. The remark says more about the world Louis inhabited than about his character specifically, though it says something about his character too. In a world where women were understood primarily in relation to the functions they served, a wife who had served her function without complaint and who had now died quietly was a wife who had performed well. The grief was for the disruption, not for the person, or if it was for the person, the language available to express it had been so thoroughly shaped by the functional understanding of marriage that the two things had become indistinguishable. Montespan was a different kind of person entirely. She arrived in Louis's life in the early 1660s, and she was not calculating in the way that the word calculating implies deliberate coldness. She was strategic in the way that intelligent people in constrained situations are strategic, which is to say that she understood the rules of the game she was playing and played them well. She was also, underneath the strategy, genuinely witty and genuinely charming and genuinely capable of producing in Louis something that was not simply political convenience, but something more like pleasure in her specific company. She dominated the court for more than a decade. Her apartments at Versailles were among the most important social spaces in the palace. Her opinions on appointments, on fashion, on the various dramas of court life, carried weight that was out of proportion to her official position, because her access to the king was understood to be real access, the kind that translated into outcomes rather than merely into the appearance of influence. She was also a mother on a scale that required management. Louis acknowledged the children openly, an unusual degree of official recognition for the offspring of a mistress, and the children grew up in the peculiar circumstances of royal illegitimacy, connected to the center of French power by blood and disconnected from it by law, the affair of the poisons, which would eventually reach toward her name, belongs to the next chapter. What belongs here is the shape of her time at the center, which was real and significant, and which ended not through any single dramatic event, but through the slower process of Louis's attention shifting toward something that Montespan, for all her intelligence and all her gifts, could not provide. What she could not provide was steadiness. What Louis was looking for, as he moved through his 40s, and the early markers of the man he was becoming in middle age became more visible, was not brilliance or beauty or the kind of charged social energy that Montespan generated. He was looking for something quieter than that and more durable. He found it in the woman who had been in the same rooms as him and Montespan for years, caring for his children, watching, saying very little that the court recorded, and being, in her specific and unusual way, exactly what the situation was going to require. Françoise d'Aubigné's life before Louis is a story in itself. She had been born into poverty, had survived circumstances that were genuinely difficult, had made her way through the world by a combination of intelligence and a quality of gravitational seriousness that was rarer at Versailles than wit or beauty. She had become the governess of Louis's children by Montespan, and through this role had come into a proximity to Louis that was initially functional and then became something else. What it became is not precisely nameable. They were almost certainly secretly married after the death of Maria Theresa in 1683, though the marriage was never officially acknowledged. She was given the title Marquise de Maintenon. She occupied a position at court that was permanent and central and technically undefined, which was itself a form of power, because undefined positions cannot be taken from you by the procedures that govern defined ones. What she gave Louis, and what neither of his previous significant relationships had given him in quite this way, was the experience of being known by someone who was not afraid of him. She had opinions, and she expressed them, and she was not afraid of his displeasure in the way that people who depended entirely on his favor were afraid of it. Her position was rooted in something that was harder to withdraw than favor. She was also deeply religious in a way that resonated with the Louis who was moving through his 50s. The Louis who was attending more masses and spending more time in the chapel and beginning to understand his life through a framework that was more explicitly Catholic than the Apollo mythology of his youth. 3 women in the same room in 1672, each of them shaped by the gravity of one man's position and one man's choices and one man's understanding of what women were for. One of them maintained her dignity through 23 years of being peripheral to the story of her own marriage and died, having never caused him grief but once. One of them claimed the center of his world and held it for a decade and discovered that centers, when claimed by people who are not the king, are not actually the center at all. One of them found a position beside him that lasted 30 years, outlasting everything else, because she had understood something that the other 2, for all their different qualities, had not quite grasped. She had understood that what Louis needed most was not someone who reflected his light back at him. He had mirrors for that. He needed someone who could sit with him in the dark. The woman who started it all was not noble. Catherine Monvoisin, known to her clients as La Voisin, ran a business in Paris that did not have a name in the way that legitimate businesses have names, but that had, by the late 1670s, a clientele that would have surprised anyone who believed that the appetite for magic and poison and the darker varieties of assistance was confined to the lower orders of French society. She was a fortune-teller, primarily, which in the 17th century occupied a complicated legal and moral space, officially condemned by the church and the law, practically tolerated in the way that things are tolerated when the demand for them is sufficiently broad and the enforcement sufficiently inconsistent. She read palms and cast horoscopes and provided the kind of reassurance and prediction that people sought from her for the same reasons that people have always sought them. Because the future was uncertain, and uncertainty was frightening, and someone who claimed to know what was coming was offering something genuinely valuable, regardless of whether the claim was true. But fortune-telling was not all she sold. She also sold to clients who asked the right questions and demonstrated that they could be trusted with the answer. Things that were more concrete than predictions. Love potions, which may or may not have been effective, depending on what was in them and what effect was being sought. Abortifacients, for which there was a steady and unsurprising demand in a world that had limited alternatives. And Poison. Actual poison. Compounds designed to produce illness or death in specific individuals. For clients who had specific individuals they needed ill or dead. Her client list. When it was eventually disclosed under the pressure of a police investigation that began in 1677 and expanded in ways that no one initially anticipated, included names from some of the most distinguished families in France. This was the first thing that the affair of the poisons revealed. Before it revealed anything about Versailles, specifically the appetite for the services La Voisin provided was not a lower-class phenomenon. It was a human phenomenon, distributed across society in proportion to the problems that people in different social positions needed solved. And the problems of the very wealthy and very ambitious were not smaller than other people's problems. They were just more expensively addressed. The investigation was run by Nicolas de la Reynie, the Lieutenant General of Police for Paris. A man of considerable competence and almost unlimited procedural thoroughness. He followed the threads where they led. He recorded what witnesses said and what the accused confessed to, under conditions that included torture, which means that the confessions need to be read with the understanding that people, under torture, will say what their torturers want to hear, as well as what is actually true, and that disentangling the two is not always possible from the evidence that remains. What he found, as the investigation expanded through 1678 and 1679 and into the early 1680s, was a network larger and stranger and more deeply embedded in French society than anyone had expected. The network included not just La Voisin and her immediate associates, but a web of suppliers and clients and intermediaries that extended from the streets of Paris into spaces that the investigation was not initially designed to reach. Into Versailles. The names that appeared in the testimony included names from the court, eventually, the name of Françoise Athénée de Montespan. What exactly Montespan was alleged to have done, and how much of the allegation reflected truth, and how much was the product of witnesses competing to provide information that might reduce their own exposure, is a question that historians have been examining for 3 centuries without arriving at a definitive answer. The allegations were serious that she had used love potions to maintain Louis's affection, that she had participated in ceremonies that the official record describes in language designed to convey gravity without being too specific, that she had sought more extreme measures against rivals for the king's attention. La Reynie understood that confessions obtained under torture from people who had every incentive to name the most powerful names they could think of were not the same as proof. He was careful to distinguish in his reports between what was documented and what was alleged. The distinction mattered for a straightforward practical reason. The documented facts were already alarming. The allegations, if true, were catastrophic, and whether they were true or not, they had been made, and the making of them created a situation that had no clean resolution. Louis was told. He had to be told. What Louis did with the information about Montespan is what matters most for understanding this chapter in his story. He did not have her arrested. He did not have her tried. What he did was something more characteristic of the man he actually was, something that Mazarin would have recognized as the move of a man who understood that information was a resource to be managed rather than a force to be acted on reflexively. He ordered La Reynie to continue the investigation. And the investigation did continue, producing more arrests, more trials, more executions of the lower-level participants in the network. La Voisin herself was burned in 1680, after a trial that established what could be established and left unresolved what could not be resolved. Dozens of other participants were executed or imprisoned or sent to the galleys. But a separate chamber, established specifically to handle the most sensitive cases, the cases involving noble clients and the most serious allegations, was quietly closed in 1682. The records of that chamber, including the testimony that touched on the highest-ranking names, were sealed and eventually, reportedly, burned. Louis destroyed the evidence. This is the thing about the affair of the poisons that is most illuminating about Louis XIV. Not the existence of the network or the specific nature of the allegations, but the response. The man who had built a system of total control, who had organized the entire physical and social environment of France around his ability to see and manage everything happening in it, chose not to see this. He had the information. He had the investigation. He had, in La Reine, an administrator of exceptional competence who was doing exactly what he had been given his position to do. And Louis shut the most sensitive part of it down and burned the papers. The reason is not complicated, though it is human in ways that complicate the simple story of Louis, the absolute ruler who bent France to his will. Montespan was the mother of his children. She had been, for more than a decade, the most important person in his private life. Whatever the allegations were, and whatever their truth, acting on them in the full public manner that justice theoretically required would have exposed the center of his private world to scrutiny that he was not willing to permit. The same instinct that drove the system of Versailles, the need to control what was visible, the intolerance for anything that revealed the gap between the image and the reality, operated here on the most personal possible subject. He could not afford to pursue justice, if justice meant revealing that the woman he had loved most publicly had been doing things in the dark that the image of his court could not absorb. He chose the image. La Reine knew. He wrote about what he knew in documents that survived the burning, carefully, in the manner of a man who understood that he was recording something for posterity while operating within constraints that prevented him from doing anything more useful with the recording. He was a civil servant of exceptional ability, working in a system that was organized to produce exactly the outcome it produced, which was the protection of the center at the expense of the full truth. The court continued. The ceremonies continued. Montespan's position at Versailles gradually diminished over the following years, not because of what the investigation had suggested, but through the slower process of Louis's attention shifting elsewhere, which had the same eventual result. She retired from court life in the 1690s. She died in 1707, having spent her final years in charitable works and religious observance. La Voisin burned in the Place de Grève in 1680, in front of the crowd that attended such events. The investigation that had found her was partially closed. The papers that told the rest of the story no longer exist. The perfume continued. Versailles smelled of flowers and wax, and the particular combination of scents that accumulated in spaces where many people lived in close proximity and where the available solutions to that problem were expensive and fragrant. Beneath the perfume was whatever had been beneath it before the investigation began. The investigation had not changed what was there. It had only, briefly, come close to making it visible. Louis had made sure it went back to being invisible. The candles kept burning. The mirrors kept reflecting. The ceremonies of each morning and each evening proceeded in their prescribed order, and if anyone in the rooms where they happened was thinking about burned papers and sealed chambers and the careful management of what the king chose to know and not know, they were not saying so. At Versailles, discretion was not a virtue. It was a survival skill. Everyone who remained there had it. The First War felt like destiny. This is important to understand about Louis. in 1667, when he sent French armies into the Spanish Netherlands for the first time and began the sequence of military campaigns that would define the next 4 decades of European history. He was not acting out of desperation or defensiveness. He was not responding to a threat. He was a 28-year-old king at the height of his physical powers, commanding the best organized army in Europe, with a finance minister who had built him a revenue base sufficient to sustain military operations, and with a theory of French greatness that included the idea that French greatness should be visible on the map. The specific justification for the First War, the War of Devolution, was legal in its framing, a claim based on inheritance customs in the Spanish Netherlands that Louis argued gave him rights to certain territories following the death of his father-in-law, Philip IV of Spain. The legal argument was real, but it was also exactly the kind of argument that is produced when someone who has decided to do something needs a reason to have decided it. What he had built to pursue these ambitions was genuinely impressive as a military instrument. Louvois had spent years reorganizing the French army in ways that addressed the structural problems that had made 17th-century armies so difficult to sustain in the field. The logistics were better. The supply chains were more reliable. The officers were more professional and less dependent on the feudal networks that had made the armies of previous generations so difficult to control. The army that moved into the Spanish Netherlands in 1667 was the largest and most effectively organized force in Europe. It won quickly and without much difficulty. The speed of the victory was clarifying for everyone, including Louis. What had taken months of campaigning in previous conflicts was accomplished in weeks. The Spanish defenders, operating with the resources of a declining empire that had been bleeding wealth and population for a generation, could not match what France was bringing. Louis was present for the campaign. This mattered to him and matters for understanding him, because he was not a king who directed wars from a distance. He rode with his armies, visited the sieges, was seen by his soldiers and by the populations of the territories he was acquiring, and understood the experience of military campaigning as something he had personal knowledge of, rather than something he understood through the reports of others. He liked it. The movement and the logistics and the particular satisfaction of plans executed successfully suited a temperament that found the stillness of the court. For all that he had built the court and managed it with great skill, somewhat constraining, the war lasted less than a year before a diplomatic settlement, arranged through the intervention of the Triple Alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, and Sweden, produced the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1668. Louis kept some of what he had taken. He did not keep everything. He accepted the settlement without apparent bitterness, but he did not forget the intervention, particularly the Dutch intervention, which he experienced as a piece of presumption from a republic he found philosophically uncongenial and practically irritating. The Dutch had organized against him. A republic, without a king, without the kind of centralized authority that Louis considered the basic requirement for stable government, had played a significant role in limiting what he could acquire through a war he had won militarily. He sat with this for 4 years. In 1672 he came back. The war against the Dutch Republic is the conflict that most clearly reveals the character of Louis's approach to military power in this period, because it is the conflict where the gap between the stated justification and the actual motivation is smallest and the consequences were most far-reaching. He wanted to punish the Dutch for their presumption and to demonstrate that the kind of diplomatic maneuvering they had engaged in 1668 carried consequences that the perpetrators would remember. The initial French advance was so rapid and so overwhelming that it produced a crisis in the Dutch Republic that came very close to destroying it. French armies crossed the Rhine and moved through Dutch territory faster than anyone had anticipated was possible, taking city after city. And for a period of weeks, in the summer of 1672, it appeared genuinely possible that the Republic would simply cease to exist. What happened instead is the thing that should have told Louis something he did not fully absorb at the time. The Dutch opened the dikes, the decision to flood their own land, to deliberately inundate the polders and the fields and the infrastructure that generations of Dutch engineering had created by reclaiming them from the sea, was made by men who had calculated that a flooded Netherlands was preferable to a conquered Netherlands. They destroyed what they had built rather than let him have it. The flooding stopped the French advance. The flooded land could not be crossed by the armies that had crossed the Rhine with such ease. Louis was 33 years old, and the most powerful military force in Europe had just been stopped by water that the people he was trying to conquer had deliberately released onto their own farms. The image of this, the willingness of the Dutch to flood their own country rather than surrender to him, was a measurement of something that maps and casualty lists do not easily capture. It was a measurement of how afraid they were, and what it should have suggested, though it did not suggest it with sufficient force to change the direction of his policy, was that fear of this magnitude, distributed across enough people in enough countries, eventually produces a response proportional to the fear the war ground on for 6 years, expanding to include France's neighbours in ways that wars of this kind tend to expand, drawing in Spain and the Holy Roman Empire as the initial conflict metastasized into something larger. By the time the Treaty of Nijmegen ended it, in 1678, Louis had gained territory and could fairly claim a military success. But the shape of what had happened was different from the shape of the First War. The First War had been quick and clean and had confirmed the image of French military supremacy. This one had been long and expensive and had required the full weight of the French military and financial apparatus to produce an outcome that could be called victory. The wars that followed continued the expansion of French territory and the expansion of French expenditure and the expansion of European fear and European coalitions designed to limit both. Each time Louis acquired something, the diplomatic response grew more organized and more committed and more willing to sustain the costs of opposing him. The burning of the Palatinate in 1689 and the years following it stands as the moment when the character of the wars changed most visibly. The Rhineland territories, devastated in these campaigns, were not primarily military targets. They were burned in the application of a strategy that understood destruction of an enemy's resources as a military instrument, as a way of preventing those resources from supporting future opposition. Louvois endorsed the strategy. Louis did not override it. In the villages of the Palatinate, that winter, families who had lived on the same land for generations walked away from burning houses in the snow. They were not soldiers. They were not participants in any political dispute. They were the people on the ground beneath the campaigns that were being decided in palaces and council chambers. Their names did not appear in the orders that destroyed their homes, and they did not appear in the victory narratives that celebrated the campaigns as expressions of French greatness. The person who issued those orders was not in the Palatinate when it burned. He was at Versailles, where the mirrors reflected the light and the ceremonies proceeded in their prescribed order, and the image of Apollo continued to suggest that the center of French power was a source of illumination rather than of smoke. The wars made France larger. They made France more expensive. They made Europe more organized against France, more coherent in its understanding that a France with Louis at its center was a France that would keep expanding until something stopped it, and that the something would have to be collective, because no individual power was sufficient on its own. This is the dynamic that his first campaign had set in motion, and that each subsequent campaign had reinforced. The very success of the French military was producing the conditions that made future success progressively harder to achieve. The better France was at war. The more of Europe organized against France, being good at war. He understood this intellectually. His diplomats explained it to him. Colbert's letters described the financial dimensions of it with clarity. He understood it, and he continued the campaigns. Because stopping the campaigns would have required abandoning the image of French glory that the campaigns were designed to produce and sustain. And the image was not something that could be partially abandoned. You were Apollo, or you were not. You were the sun, or you were not. In the towns of Normandy and Burgundy and Provence, the families who were paying the taxes that funded the wars and providing the sons who fought in them were living through decades of a foreign policy they had no voice in shaping and no mechanism for questioning. They were the weight that the glory was resting on. They were the ground that made it possible for the palace to be built above them. The limit was coming. It was organizing. It was learning his methods and his patterns and his weaknesses, the way that opponents of someone very powerful learn, by watching very carefully for a very long time, and then working together in ways they would not have worked together if he had given them less reason to be afraid. He had given them every reason. The limit would arrive on schedule. The document was signed on October the 18th, 1685, at Fontainebleau, and Louis believed he was completing something. That is the thing that requires understanding before anything else about this moment can be understood. He was not acting out of cruelty, at least not in the sense of wanting to cause suffering for its own sake. He was not acting impulsively or without consideration of the consequences. He had been moving toward this for years, through a series of increasingly restrictive measures that had been building pressure on the Huguenot communities of France for more than a decade. And when he finally signed what became known as the Edict of Fontainebleau, revoking the protections that the Edict of Nantes had extended to French Protestants for 87 years, he experienced it as an act of completion. He was finishing what his grandfather Henry IV had started. Or so the logic went. Henry had issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598 as a compromise, a practical solution to a civil war that had exhausted everyone and that could not be ended by either side winning outright. The compromise had given French Protestants the legal right to practice their faith, to hold certain offices, to maintain certain fortified towns as guarantees of their safety. It was always understood by the Catholics who accepted it and by the Protestants who depended on it as a settlement rather than a resolution, as something that addressed the immediate crisis without resolving the underlying question of what France was and what kind of unity was possible within it. Louis had decided the underlying question. France was Catholic. Several forces converged in that decision: pressure from Rome and from the bishops who surrounded him. His own deep Catholic piety that had been growing more central to his identity as he aged. The logic of absolutist statecraft that understood religious unity as a precondition of political unity. And the influence of Maintenon, whose faith was genuine and who shared the general conviction that a kingdom divided in belief was a kingdom vulnerable in ways that mattered. These forces did not produce a simple or single motivation. They produced a man who believed, with what appears to have been genuine conviction, that what he was doing was right and necessary and historically destined. The Protestants who remained in France were, in this framework, un anormalu, a remainder from an older and more disordered time, and their conversion to Catholicism was not a violation of their rights, but a fulfillment of the natural direction of French history. He had also spent 15 years systematically removing the guarantees that had protected Huguenot communities, dissolving the garrison rights and restricting the public expression of Protestant worship and applying administrative pressure that had already produced a significant number of conversions before the edict was formally revoked. He believed, when he signed the document at Fontainebleau, that the work was essentially done, that the Protestants who remained were a manageable remnant whose conversion would follow naturally once the legal framework sustaining their community was removed. He was wrong about this in ways that had consequences he did not foresee. What happened in the months and years following the revocation was not mass conversion. It was mass emigration. The numbers that historians find most credible range from 200,000 to 400,000 people over the course of roughly a decade, moving through the Netherlands and England and Prussia and Switzerland and South Africa and the various other places that were willing to receive them. They were not random in their composition. The people who left were, on average, among the most economically productive members of French society. Consider a single family in Lyon in the autumn of 1685. The father is a silk weaver, the third generation of his family to work the trade, and he has spent 20 years building relationships with merchants in Amsterdam and London who buy what he produces. The techniques he uses were developed by his grandfather and refined by his father and improved by him. He employs 6 people. He owns his equipment. He has a house. He has 2 weeks to decide. He can convert. He can become, on paper, Catholic, attend the required masses, say the required things, and remain in the country where his family has lived for a century. Or he can leave, taking whatever he can carry, giving up the house and most of the equipment and the physical infrastructure of everything he has built, and go somewhere else and start again. He leaves. He goes to Amsterdam, where the Dutch Republic, which Louis had tried to destroy in 1672, receives him because the Dutch understand what they are receiving. He brings his techniques and his relationships and his understanding of the trade that took 3 generations to build. He employs people in Amsterdam. His children grow up Dutch. Multiply that family by 200,000. Multiply it across the silk weavers of Lyon and Tours, the woolens manufacturers of Normandy, the watchmakers and goldsmiths of Paris, the merchants with their trade networks and their letters of credit and their relationships with partners across Northern Europe. The people who left were not the people France could most easily afford to lose. They were the people France could least afford to lose. And they went to the countries that France would spend the next century trying to outcompete. Brandenburg-Prussia, a state that Louis considered beneath his serious attention, received a substantial portion of the Huguenot emigrants and gave them what France had just taken away: the legal right to practice their faith and conduct their businesses. The Prussian economy benefited in ways that were visible within a generation. The English textile industry received techniques and expertise that had been French advantages. The Dutch Republic, which Louis had tried to flood into submission, became more capable for the people it received. Vauban wrote about this. He was a Catholic, and his objection to the revocation was not theological, but practical. The observation of an engineer who looked at what had just been removed from the structure and understood what would happen to the structure when something that had been supporting it was gone. He estimated the losses in people and in economic activity. With the precision of a man who built fortifications for a living and understood that a wall with a hole in it was not the same as a wall without one, Louis received Vauban's analysis and did not change his assessment of what he had done. The machinery of forced conversion that operated inside France in the same period is the part of this story that the image of Louis as a great and glorious king is least equipped to contain. The dragonnades. The billeting of soldiers in Protestant households as a method of coercion produced conversions in large numbers, because soldiers quartered in your home with implicit license to make themselves unpleasant are a very effective argument for anything their hosts are being asked to agree to. The conversions produced by this method were documented and were legally recognized. They were not, in any sense that the theology Louis was claiming to defend would have recognized, faith. This did not prevent them from being used as evidence that the conversion of France was proceeding as intended. In the hills of the Cevennes, in the south of France, the response to the revocation and its enforcement was not conversion, and it was not emigration. It was revolt. The Camisard uprising, which began in 1702, was the armed resistance of Huguenot communities that had not left and would not convert, and found themselves in a war that lasted years, fought in the scrubby hills of the Languedoc against royal armies that had the numbers and the equipment, and that still took longer than anyone expected to suppress a population that had decided it had nothing left to lose by fighting. Louis was 63 years old when the Camisard uprising began, and he was dealing simultaneously with the War of the Spanish Succession, which was consuming resources and attention on a scale that made the Cevennes feel like a secondary problem, which it was in military terms and was not in human terms. The people in those hills were French. They had been French for generations. They were fighting the King of France, because the King of France had decided that their existence, as they had been living, it was incompatible with the France he was building. He had wanted one king, one law, one faith. He had one king. He had one law, more or less, in the sense that the legal framework of the kingdom had been substantially unified over the course of his reign. The faith had produced a revolt in the hills and an emigration of skills and capital that Colbert's successors were still trying to account for. The document signed at Fontainebleau in October of 1685 was one page. It revoked in a paragraph what had taken a generation of civil war to establish and another generation to make work. In Amsterdam, the son of the silk weaver from Lyon was learning Dutch and teaching his father's techniques to people who had never been to France and never would go. In Berlin, the merchants who had rebuilt their networks in Brandenburg were doing business with partners in Hamburg and London and thinking, when they thought about France at all, about what they had left and what they had been given in exchange for leaving it. Louis had wanted to complete France. What he had completed, in ways he did not intend and did not see, was the partial transfer of French productive capacity to the countries that France would spend the next century trying to outcompete. The document was one page. The consequences were an atlas. The surgery took place in the early morning of November the 18th, 1686, in the king's bedchamber at Versailles, with the curtains drawn and a small number of carefully selected witnesses present. And when it was finished, and the king was resting, and the instruments had been removed, and the room restored to something approaching its normal condition, the official version of events was that everything had gone well. This was true in the sense that Louis survived it. It was incomplete in the sense that what he had survived was, by the medical standards of any era, including his own, something that no one would choose to experience if the choice were available, a procedure performed without the anesthetics that did not yet exist, for a condition that had been causing him significant discomfort for months, by a surgeon who had spent the preceding period developing and refining his technique specifically for this case. The condition was an anal fistula. The surgeon was Charles-François Félix, the royal physician who had been given the task of treating the king and who had, with the thoroughness that the situation demanded, developed a specialized curved instrument designed for exactly this procedure. Louis recovered from the surgery over a period of months. He bore it, by the accounts of those present, with a composure that his physicians found remarkable, and that was, in its way, as skilled a performance as anything he had produced on the stage or in the Hall of Mirrors. He was required to submit to follow-up procedures as the healing progressed, required to allow his body to be managed and maintained by other people's hands in ways that had no ceremony to make them bearable, and no audience to make the bearing of them meaningful. He bore it quietly and returned, as soon as he was able, to the public performance of being Louis XIV. This is the tension that runs through the last 30 years of his reign. The gap between the body that was increasingly subject to the ordinary failures of aging and the image that was required to remain constant, that could not be permitted to show the signs of mortality, because the image was not mortal and the image was the point. His teeth were gone by his 40s, extracted over years by the methods available to 17th century dentistry. And the extractions had not always gone cleanly. A procedure intended to remove a tooth had resulted in damage to the upper jaw, a perforation that caused Louis to expel liquid through his nose when he drank, an ungovernable physical fact that the ceremonies of Versailles simply worked around, that the people who saw it daily learned not to see. That was never mentioned in the official records of the court, because mentioning it would have required acknowledging that the king's body behaved in ways that were not commensurate with the image of Apollo. He had a stomach that caused him persistent trouble, the consequence of an appetite that was not modest and of the French court's approach to eating, which prioritized abundance and variety in ways that were not ideal for digestive health over several decades. Saint-Simon, the Duke who wrote the memoirs that remain one of the most valuable records of life at Versailles, noted that Louis ate at every meal with an appetite that astonished observers, consuming quantities that would have been remarkable in a healthy young man, and that, in a man in his 60s and 70s, seemed to function on some principle that ordinary physiology could not explain. The gout came, as it comes to many men who have eaten and drunk richly for decades, and it moved through his joints with the particular cruelty of a disease that makes the ordinary business of walking and sitting and standing, the ordinary movements that the ceremonies of Versailles required continuously, into exercises in managed pain. He did not cancel the ceremonies. He did not stop the walks through the gardens or the hunts that he continued to attend, even when riding had become difficult. He adjusted. He found ways to maintain the appearance of the physical vigor that the image required even as the physical vigor itself declined. And then there was Vauban, the man who had built the walls that protected France, who had spent his career in the fields and the fortifications and the provincial towns where the wars were actually fought and the people who paid for them actually lived, submitted his document in 1707, was stripped of his honors, and died a few months later in the spring of that year. He had been right about the revocation. He had been right about the tax burden. He had been right about what was happening to the 10th of France he described as reduced to beggary, and he had been punished for being right, which is the specific punishment reserved in systems of absolute power for people who tell the absolute truth to the absolute ruler. Louis had built a system in which the truth about certain things could not be said. Vauban had found this out. Colbert had worked within it, carefully and with a talent for framing his concerns in language that could be heard without requiring the king to act on them. La Reynie had found, in the affair of the poisons, the specific point at which the system's requirement for the suppression of certain truths overrode even the requirements of justice. The body of the king was another of those truths. The king's body hurt. The king's teeth were gone. The king's jaw had been damaged by a physician trying to help. The king's leg, in his final years, would turn black with gangrene, and the smell of it would be present in his rooms in ways that no amount of flowers and incense could fully address. None of this appeared in the official record of the reign. None of it appeared in the paintings or the tapestries or the ceremonial accounts of the king's daily life. The lever was recorded. The decisions of the council were recorded. The military campaigns were recorded in the language of glory and strategic genius. The body that made all of this possible, that had been required for 76 years to perform kingship without interruption and without complaint, was present in the historical record only as an occasion for the performance, never as the thing beneath the performance that was keeping it going. Through an increasingly significant act of will, he sat for portraits in his final years that show a man who is, in the language of the painted face, still Louis XIV, still the king, still the center, still the sun. The portraits are not dishonest. Exactly. In the way that all images are not exactly dishonest. They show what is actually there. But they show it through the visual grammar of royal portraiture, which was a grammar designed for a specific purpose. And that purpose was not documentary truth, but the production of the appropriate impression of permanence and power. The appropriate impression was produced. The man beneath it hurt. He had hurt, in various ways. For most of his adult life, he had taken the hurt and placed it in the part of himself that he had been keeping separate from what other people could see since he was 12 years old, and lying in a bed with a torch being held to his face. And he had continued performing, and the performance had continued to be, by any reasonable external measure, successful. Success that is maintained through the suppression of what is actually happening. Beneath it is a specific kind of achievement. It requires more than talent. It requires the willingness to keep paying a cost that no one else can see, indefinitely, without the option of stopping, because the performance and the person have become sufficiently intertwined that stopping the performance is not something that can be done while the person continues. He could not stop. He did not stop. The ceremonies continued until the body could not continue them. And when the body could not continue them, he died. And the ceremonies continued without him, because the ceremonies had never been about him. Specifically, in the way that a human life is about a specific person, they had been about the role, and the role was permanent in ways that the person occupying it was not. The morning after he died, someone performed the lever for his successor. The successor was 5 years old. The ceremonies did not notice the difference. Charles II of Spain died on November 1st, 1700, and the problem he left behind had been visible for decades. He had no children. He had been married twice and had produced no children from either marriage, which was not entirely surprising, given that he was the product of generations of Habsburg intermarriage, so extreme that the inbreeding had produced in him a collection of physical and cognitive difficulties that made his survival to the cried age of 38 remarkable, and his ability to govern Spain, something that depended heavily on the people around him being willing to govern it in his name. He had a jaw that protruded so severely he could not chew properly. He spoke with difficulty. He was, for much of his reign, in poor health, of the kind that suggested the body was doing its best with materials that had been compromised before he was born. What he did have was a throne. The throne of Spain in 1700 was still, despite everything that had happened to Spain over the previous century, one of the significant thrones of Europe. It came with the Spanish Netherlands, with Milan, with Naples and Sicily, with the Philippines, with the remnants of the American Empire that still generated substantial wealth even in its diminished condition. Whoever inherited that throne would inherit a position of considerable weight in European affairs, and whoever inherited it would change the balance of power in ways that every court in Europe had been calculating for years. The two serious candidates were the Bourbon and the Habsburg. Louis's grandson, Philip of Anjou, had a claim through his grandmother, who had been a Spanish princess. The Habsburg candidate, the Archduke Charles, had a claim through a different line of descent. Both claims were real. Both came with complications. The question of which one Charles II would recognize as his heir was a question that European diplomacy had been attempting to resolve through partition treaties. Agreements that would divide the Spanish inheritance between the candidates in ways that prevented either the Bourbons or the Habsburgs from absorbing too much at once. Louis had signed one of these partition treaties. He had agreed, in principle, to a solution that would have given his grandson part of the Spanish inheritance without giving him all of it. A solution that the other European powers could accept because it did not make France dramatically more powerful than it already was. Then Charles II died, and his will was opened, and the will contained something different from what the partition treaties had arranged. He had left the entire Spanish inheritance, undivided, to Philip of Anjou, and he had added a condition if Philip accepted. He had to accept everything, because splitting the inheritance was what Charles's will specifically prohibited. Louis sat with this for 9 days. The 9 days are important because they tell you something about how he understood the situation. He was not impulsive. He had not become impulsive in his old age. He was 62 years old, experienced in the management of European power in ways that few people alive could match. And he understood exactly what accepting the will would mean. It would mean abandoning the partition treaty. It would mean giving his grandson the entire Spanish inheritance. It would mean that, for the first time in the history of Europe, the kingdoms of France and Spain would be under the rule of the same dynastic family. He also understood what refusing would mean. It would mean watching the Archduke Charles take Spain instead, which would mean a Habsburg presence pressing against French borders from multiple directions. A strategic problem that French foreign policy had been working to prevent for generations. On November the 16th, 1700, he brought Philip of Anjou before the assembled court at Versailles and presented him to the Spanish ambassador. He said, or was reported to have said, that there were no longer any Pyrenees. The phrase may be apocryphal in its exact form, but the meaning was not apocryphal. Louis had accepted the will. Philip would be Philip V of Spain. The Bourbon dynasty would sit on 2 of the largest thrones in Europe. The war that followed was the most expensive and the most damaging and the longest of Louis's reign. And it was a war that he had chosen, in the specific sense that an acceptance of the will was a choice with foreseeable consequences, and he had made it with full awareness of what those consequences were likely to be. The Grand Alliance that formed against France in 1701 included England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, and most of the smaller German states. The countries that had been fighting French expansion piecemeal for 3 decades had arrived at a shared understanding that piecemeal resistance was insufficient and that the only way to address the problem was together. They had generals who were in this war, something that France had not previously encountered in quite the same combination. Marlborough, commanding the English and Dutch forces, and Eugene of Savoy, commanding the imperial forces, were not simply competent military professionals. They were among the finest military minds of the age. People who understood the logistics and the strategy of large-scale warfare at a level that matched, and in some respects, exceeded what France could bring against them. The first large engagement that demonstrated this was Blenheim. In August of 1704, the French and Bavarian forces met the Allied forces under Marlborough and Eugene at the village of Blindheim on the Danube. The battle lasted most of a summer day and ended in a French defeat of a kind that France had not experienced in living memory. A defeat so complete that it changed in one afternoon the strategic situation that Louis had been building for decades. 30,000 French and Bavarian soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured. Tallard himself, the French commander, was taken prisoner and spent the next several years in England, where he is credited with introducing the cultivation of celery to English gardeners, a contribution that history has found easier to remember than the battle that produced the opportunity for it. Louis received the news at Versailles. He had been receiving good news from his wars for so long that the machinery for receiving bad news had not been exercised much, and the people who had to tell him what had happened at Blenheim were aware that they were doing something that had not been done to a French king in a very long time. They told him. He received it with the composure that he brought to everything, and then he went to Mass, and then he met with his council, and the machinery of governance continued in the way that it was designed to continue. But something had changed. Blenheim was not a temporary setback. It was evidence of a new military reality, that the armies France was fighting had become as good as, or better than, the armies France was deploying, and that the advantage of numbers and organization that Louvois had built was no longer sufficient on its own to produce the victories that Louis's strategic position required. Ramillies followed in 1706, another catastrophic defeat, another day in which everything built over years was dismantled in hours. Oudenarde in 1708. The pattern was becoming undeniable, and the people around Louis, who were capable of reading it honestly, were beginning to do so, at least in private. Then came the winter of 1708 to 1709, and the winter concentrated everything into a single, unbearable image. It was the coldest winter in Europe in a century. The cold arrived in January and did not leave in the way that winter cold was supposed to leave. Rivers froze that had never frozen in living memory. The Seine froze at Paris. The sea froze in ports along the northern coast. The olive trees of Provence, which had survived every winter in the recorded history of the region, died. The wheat that had been sown in the autumn froze in the ground and did not come up in the spring. The harvest failure that followed was not a surprise to anyone who understood agriculture. In the cities, the price of bread rose to levels that consumed most of what a working family earned. In Paris, people stood in lines outside bakeries from before dawn, waiting for bread that was not always there when the doors opened. A woman in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine on a February morning in 1709, standing in line at 4 in the morning, did not know the strategic situation in Flanders. She knew that she had been standing in the cold for 2 hours, and that there might not be bread when the door opened, and that her children were at home waiting to find out. In the countryside, the situation was worse. The harvest had failed. The reserves from previous years had been consumed. The taxes that funded the war continued to be collected because the war continued to require funding. And the people from whom the taxes were collected were the people who had the least ability to pay them and the least voice in the decisions that had made paying them necessary. Louis was 70 years old that winter. He was writing letters. The letters went to the governors of the French provinces. and what they said was something that no document from the previous 60 years of his reign resembled. He told them that he did not have the money to pay his armies. He asked them to help. He asked them, the men who governed the regions of France in his name, to find resources from their provinces that could sustain the military operations that he could not afford to sustain from the treasury. The letters exist. They are in the archives. They are written in the formal language of royal communication, maintaining the conventions of address and register that all correspondence to and from the king maintained. But underneath the conventions, there is something that the conventions were not designed to contain. A king who had spent 66 years building and maintaining an image of absolute sufficiency, who had constructed a world in which the king's power to provide was the central organizing principle of everything, was asking for help. He also tried to negotiate peace. The terms that the Allied powers offered in the spring of 1709 were terms that Louis, even in his current condition, could not accept, because one of them required him to use French troops to remove his own grandson from the Spanish throne if Philip refused to abdicate voluntarily. He was being asked to make war on his own family, to deploy the French military against the dynasty he had spent his entire reign building. As the price of ending a war he could not win, he refused. And then he did something that was, for Louis XIV, without precedent. He appealed directly to the French people. He wrote a letter, or caused a letter to be written, that was read from pulpits across France, explaining the situation and asking for the support of his subjects in continuing the war. The letter acknowledged the suffering that the war had caused. It said, in terms that were as honest as anything Louis had communicated to France in his reign, that the situation was serious and that he was asking his people to endure it with him. The response was not what a cynical reading of the situation might have predicted. France did not collapse. The armies continued to fight. The war continued. Louis continued to be Louis, which at this point meant performing the function of being king with the resources available, which were less than they had ever been, and without the certainties that had always previously been available to support the performance. He was 70 years old, writing letters, asking for help, making appeals to a people he had governed by keeping at a careful distance, fighting a war he had chosen and could not end on terms he could accept, watching the treasury his ministers had built be consumed at a rate that the treasury could not sustain. The war finally ended with the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. Philip kept the Spanish throne, but agreed that the crowns of France and Spain would never be united under a single ruler, which was the guarantee that the Allied powers had been fighting to obtain. France ceded territories in North America and in Europe. The outcome was not a defeat in the technical sense, because Philip was still in Madrid, but it was not a victory in any sense that resembled what Louis had pursued for the previous 4 decades. He was 74 years old when the peace was signed. He had been at war, almost continuously. For most of his adult life, the wars had made France larger, and they had made France poorer, and they had made Europe more organized against France in ways that the peace did not dissolve, but simply paused. In the provinces of France, the men and women who had spent the past decade paying taxes and sending sons, and standing in bread lines, and praying in churches where the priest read out the king's letter, asking them to endure a little longer, went back to their ordinary lives. The ordinary lives were harder than they had been before the war. The treasury was emptier. The population was smaller. The country was more exhausted. The king at Versailles was old and in pain, and had lost, in the years since the war began, more of the people he had loved than he had lost in all the previous decades of his reign combined. The war had taken money and men and territory. What it had taken from Louis was something different and something worse. It had taken the certainty. For 60 years, he had known what France was and what he was within it, and what the future would be, because he had been building the future and could see what it was going to look like. He had been the architect of a world, and the world had been going where he directed it. The world had stopped going where he directed it. He was still performing. He would perform until he could not. But the performance and the man were closer together now than they had been in decades. Because the man was tired in ways that the performance could not entirely conceal. April the 14th, 1711. Louis received the news in the morning, in the manner that important news was always received at Versailles, formally and with the appropriate witnesses present. Because even the receipt of catastrophic personal information was a ceremony at Versailles, and ceremonies required witnesses. His son was dead, Louis de France, called Monseigneur, the Grand Dauphin, the man who had been the heir to the throne of France for 50 years, had died of smallpox at the age of 49. He was not a remarkable man, by the accounts of people who knew him, not gifted with his father's energy or his father's intelligence or his father's capacity for sustained application to the business of governing. He had spent his life in the particular limbo of a crown prince under a father who was never going to abdicate, waiting for a role that kept receding as his father simply continued, and now he was dead and would never not recede. And Louis, who was 72 years old and had been king since he was 4, was now a man whose son had died before him. He bore it. That is what the records say about how he received each of the deaths that followed, that he bore it, which is a word that tells you something is happening and tells you nothing about what the happening costs. 9 months later, in February of 1712, his eldest grandson died. Louis de France, Duc de Bourgogne, had been different from his father in the ways that people who pay close attention to royal families sometimes notice when a generation produces something closer to the original. He was intelligent, serious, deeply religious in a way that his confessor and his contemporaries found genuine rather than performed, committed to the idea of kingship as a moral responsibility rather than simply an inherited position. He had been groomed for succession with the seriousness that his qualities seemed to deserve, and the people who thought about the future of France had found in him something that the court had not had in a long time, a reason for genuine optimism about what came after Louis. He died of measles, or of what the physicians of the time identified as measles. In February of 1712, he was 29 years old. He had been heir to the throne for 9 months. His wife died 12 days later, the same illness moving through the household that the protocols of Versailles made impossible to isolate from itself. Then their eldest son, 4 years old, the new Dauphin, died in March. He had been heir for perhaps 2 weeks. 3 generations of succession, gone in less than a year. The grandfather who had been expected to outlive his son had outlived his son and his grandson and his great-grandson. The line of succession that had seemed stable and populated now ran directly from Louis, 73 years old, to a single surviving infant. The infant was Louis de France, 5 years old, the younger son of the Duc de Bourgogne. He survived because the Duchesse de Ventadour, who had charge of the royal children, refused to allow the physicians to treat him in the manner they had treated his older brother. The older boy had been bled extensively, as the medical practice of the time prescribed for febrile illness, and had died of his illness or of the bleeding or of both. The Duchesse de Ventadour simply would not allow it. She held the door, and she kept the doctors out, and she nursed the child herself with the particular stubbornness of someone who has watched what the official solution produces and has decided that her judgment is worth more than the sous. Procedure. The child lived. He became, eventually, Louis XV. He was the only thing standing between the death of Louis XIV and the extinction of the direct Bourbon line. And the person who kept him alive was not a physician and not a minister of state, but a woman who decided that her own judgment mattered more than the accumulated authority of the royal medical establishment. Louis, in the months that followed these deaths, did what Louis always did, which is to say, he continued. He attended the ceremonies. He met with his council. He conducted the business of governing a country that was still emerging from the most exhausting war of his reign. He walked, when his leg permitted walking, in the gardens of Versailles that Le Nôtre had laid out 50 years earlier, and that had been maintained in their geometric perfection ever since by the labour of gardeners who pruned and replanted and raked and maintained the appearance of order that the actual natural world, left to itself, did not produce. There are accounts from people who saw him in this period of the king walking in those gardens in the late afternoons, sometimes for extended stretches, sometimes with the witnesses present at a distance that was greater than the usual distance. Versailles had been designed, among other things, to ensure that Louis was never alone. The system of attendance and ceremony and the constant presence of the court had made solitude structurally impossible for most of his reign. You could not be the Sun King and be alone, because the Sun King required witnesses in the way that the sun requires things to illuminate, but the witnesses kept dying, not the courtier. The courtiers were still there, still jostling for position, still managing their relationships and their debts and their calculations about who was rising and who was falling. The machinery of Versailles kept running with the efficiency that 60 years of fine-tuning had produced. What was dying was something else. The people who had been present from the beginning, the people who had known him before the performance, had become the only available version of him, the people in relation to whom he had existed as something more specific and more personal than the Sun King. Montespan had retired from court in the 1690s and died in 1707. Colbert had been dead since 1683. Louvois since 1691. The architects and painters and musicians who had built Versailles around him were gone, their work remaining and their persons absent in the way that work always outlasts the people who made it. Maintenon was still there. Maintenon was always there, in the quiet way that she had maintained her presence through 3 decades without ever making the maintenance of it visible as an effort. She was in her mid-70s, and she had been at his side for longer than any other person in his adult life. And whatever the nature of what existed between them, it had the quality of things that have been tested by time and by difficulty, and that have survived both. He talked to her. That much is in the record, in her own letters, and in the accounts of people who had access to the private spaces of those years. He talked to her in ways that the ceremonial language of Versailles did not permit, and that the official record of the reign did not capture. What he said is not recorded. Private conversations between people who were careful about what was recorded privately are the spaces where the most human things happened and left no trace that survived the people who experienced them. He had built a world to ensure he would never be alone. He was walking in it alone. The gardens were perfect. The paths were raked. The fountains functioned. The parterres were maintained in their impossible geometric precision by people who worked constantly to keep nature from reverting to what nature preferred. He had beaten Paris. He had beaten the nobility. He had beaten the Habsburgs and the Dutch and the English and the combined armies of the Grand Alliance, at least sufficiently to end things without a catastrophic defeat. He had not beaten time. Time had been there from the beginning, doing what time does, which is to say, proceeding at exactly the rate it always proceeds, regardless of what you build or what you believe about the permanence of what you built. The Duc de Bourgogne was dead at 29. The great-grandchild who remained was 5 years old. The man walking in the gardens was 73, and his leg hurt, and the light was beautiful, and the gardens were exactly as he had designed them to be, and the witnesses were present at their careful distance, and the performance continued. It always continued, until the morning it did not. The court noticed the silences first, not an absence of sound exactly, because Versailles was never without sound. The palace was too large and too populated for silence in any absolute sense, with its kitchens and its stables and its hundreds of rooms occupied by hundreds of people going about the business of a court that ran continuously, regardless of what was happening at its center. What the court noticed was a different quality of silence. The silence that exists around a person who has stopped filling rooms the way he used to fill them, whose presence no longer pushed the air the way it once did. Louis was in his mid-70s, and he was tired in ways that the performance could not entirely conceal. The word that his contemporaries used most often when they tried to describe him in these years was still, in some variant, formidable, which tells you that the essential quality had not disappeared, but had compressed, had become denser and less expansive. A man who had previously radiated in every direction, now conserving whatever he had left for what actually required it. What required it was still considerable. The Peace of Utrecht had been signed in 1713, but its implementation was not simple, involving ongoing negotiations and adjustments and the management of relationships with powers that had spent the past 12 years as enemies and needed to be reconstituted as something else, without anyone pretending that the 12 years had not happened. Louis engaged with this, with the thoroughness that had always characterized his governance, bringing to the work of peace the same systematic attention he had brought to the work of war. He also spent more time with Maintenon than he had in the decades when the business of the reign had filled more of the day. She had established, some years earlier, the school at Saint-Cyr, an institution for the education of girls from impoverished noble families, and it had become the project to which she gave the energy that the court no longer seemed to require from her. It was a serious institution, concerned with actual education rather than the performance of education, and it reflected something about Maintenon that the decades of her public association with Louis had sometimes obscured, which is that she had strong views about what women were capable of and what they deserved to be given the chance to become. Louis supported Saint-Cyr and visited it and paid attention to it in ways that went beyond the perfunctory support that royalty extended to charitable projects. He was interested in it. This is a small detail, but it belongs to the picture of the final years. A picture that is different from the picture of the middle decades, in ways that are not reducible to simple decline. He was also, in these years, a great-grandfather in the specific and practical sense that the 5-year-old who would become Louis XV was in the palace and required the things that small children require, which include, among other things, the attention of adults who find them interesting rather than simply important. There are accounts of Louis with the child that have a quality different from the ceremonial accounts of the king's interactions with court visitors and foreign dignitaries. A quality of genuine attention. The old man watching the small boy with something that the formal language of the period struggles to name accurately, because the formal language was not designed for this kind of observation. He told the child things. The things he told him are partially recorded, partially reconstructed from accounts of people who were present, and they have the character of things said by someone who has arrived at a position in life where the long view is the only view available, and who is trying to transmit something true about what the long view shows. Do not love war the way I loved it. That was one of them, in one variant or another, though the exact words vary across the sources that record it. The meaning is consistent across the variations he had loved. War? He had pursued it as an expression of glory, and as the natural activity of a king who understood greatness as something demonstrated in the field. And the love had cost France more than the glory had returned. Try to improve the conditions of your people, more than I was able to do. Another element that appears consistently, the acknowledgement that the conditions of the people of France had not been improved by the wars, that the treasury was depleted, and the burden on the ordinary French person was heavier than it had been when he took the throne. Whether the child understood any of this is impossible to know. He was 5 years old. What a 5-year-old takes from an old man's words is not the words themselves, but something more atmospheric. An impression of gravity and weight, and the sense that what is being said matters, even if the precise meaning is not available yet. The meaning would become available later, or it would not, depending on whether the child grew into someone who looked for it. The regency that would govern France until Louis XV came of age was already being arranged in the political discussions of these final years. And the arrangements were not entirely arrangements Louis approved of, because the regent who would govern France after his death was the Duc d'Orléans, his nephew, a man Louis had kept at a careful distance for much of his reign, and whose judgment he assessed, by most accounts, with the specific skepticism that he applied to people whose priorities he did not fully trust. He could not prevent it. The arrangements of the regency were not his to dictate in the way that the arrangements of his reign had been his to dictate, because he was managing the transition to a state in which he would no longer be present, which was a state that his entire life had been organized around not having to contemplate. He contemplated it now. He had no alternative. Maintenon in these years was a woman managing her own exhaustion alongside his. She was in her late 70s, and the years had not been light ones, and the position she had occupied for 3 decades, permanently adjacent to the center, without ever quite being acknowledged as part of it, had its own costs that were different from his costs, but not smaller. She had watched him age, and she had watched the people around him die, and she had remained, consistently and without drama, in the position she had found and maintained through qualities that Versailles did not usually reward. She wrote letters in these years, to her confessor and to friends outside Versailles, that give a different angle on the final years than the official record provides. She was not always generous in her assessments of the people and the situations she described. She was honest, in the specific way that people are honest when they are writing to someone they trust and when the official performance is not required. She was tired. She had been present for 30 years, at the level that proximity to Louis required, and she was tired. She also, in these letters, expressed something about Louis himself that the official record does not easily contain, a recognition of the specific loneliness of a man who had built a world designed to prevent loneliness and had found, in his final years, that the design was insufficient. She wrote about him with a combination of exasperation and something that was in the same territory as sorrow, the recognition of a human cost that the official account of the reign was not designed to acknowledge. The court continued to function with the precision that decades of development had built into it. The ceremonies happened. The hierarchy was maintained. The elaborate social machinery of Versailles kept running because it had been running for so long that it had become self-sustaining, requiring less and less of the original animating will that had set it in motion, and more simply the continuation of what had always been done. This self-perpetuation was both Louis's greatest administrative achievement and his most consequential inheritance to his successors. He had built something that could continue without him, which meant that it would continue without him, which meant that his successors would inherit the continuation rather than the thing itself. The form without the force that had given the form its meaning. Louis XV would be king in the sense that the ceremony and the hierarchy and the form required a king at the center. Whether he would be a king, in the sense that Louis XIV had been a king, was a question that the system itself could not answer, and that the 5-year-old walking the corridors of Versailles in 1713 could not yet answer either. In the evenings at Versailles, when the day's business was finished, and the coucher had been performed, and the witnesses had withdrawn, Maintenon stayed. This is in the record. The consistent presence of the woman who had been there for 30 years, being there at the end when the performance was finished, and there was nothing left but the man inside it. What they said to each other in those evenings is not recorded. The things said between people, when no one is watching, are the things that do not survive in the documents, which are the things that most need surviving, and are therefore the things most completely lost. The fire burned. The palace was quiet in the relative sense that Versailles was ever quiet. The great-grandchild was asleep somewhere in the building. 5 years old. The future of everything Louis had built, resting in a sleeping child who would not remember most of what was happening now. Louis was still Louis. He would be Louis until he was not. The silences the court had noticed were there, and the noticing was its own kind of record. An acknowledgement that something was changing, that no ceremony had been designed to address, and no protocol had been established to manage. The glory had been real. The gallery of mirrors had been real. The armies and the wars and the expansion of French borders and the organization of French power into a system of extraordinary sophistication and durability had been real. The cost had been real too. And the cost was still being paid by people who had not been asked whether they were willing to pay it. What remained, at the end of it, was a man in a room at night, and a woman who had stayed, and a sleeping child who would have to carry what was being left to him, and the silence that the court had noticed, which was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that all the sound in the world had never quite drowned out. Even at the height of the glory, when the candles were all lit and the mirrors were all bright, and the Sun King stood at the center of the most magnificent court in the history of the world, the silence had always been there. It was just more audible now. The leg had been wrong since June. Not wrong in the way that legs were wrong, as a matter of course, for a man of 76 who had been riding and walking and standing through ceremonies for 6 decades. Wrong in a new way. A way that the physicians recognized when they saw it, even if they did not immediately say what they recognized it to be. The discoloration began at the foot and moved slowly upward through July. And by August, it had reached the knee, and the smell that accompanied it was the smell that everyone in the room understood without being told what it meant. Gangrene. The word was not one that anyone said in the king's presence with the directness that the word deserved, because saying it directly would have required acknowledgement of what it implied, which was that the leg could not be saved, and that the question of whether the man could be saved was becoming, with each passing week, a question with a less certain answer. The physicians tried. They tried with what they had, which was the medicine of 1715, a collection of genuine insight and inherited error, and the particular overconfidence of a profession that had been performing its function with insufficient tools for so long that it had developed compensatory certainties to fill the gaps where knowledge was absent. They applied preparations. They debated among themselves about the appropriate course of action and arrived at conclusions that were not wrong so much as inadequate to the scale of what they were facing. A peasant healer from Provence appeared at Versailles in August, brought by someone who knew, someone who had heard that this person had treated conditions of this kind. The King of France, the Sun King, the builder of Versailles, and the vanquisher of the Spanish Netherlands, and the man who had organized the most magnificent court in the history of the world, submitted to examination by this person. The examination produced a treatment. The treatment did not work. The court managed itself. This is what courts do when the center is failing. When the person around whom the entire system has been organized is no longer reliably able to anchor it. And it is both a testament to the durability of what Louis had built and an illustration of its fundamental weakness. That it could continue without him, and that the continuation looked so much like the thing itself that the difference was easy to miss if you were not looking for it. The ceremonies continued into August. The lever happened, modified to accommodate the king's condition, shortened in some respects, but maintained in its essential form, because the essential form was what the system required, and the system did not provide for the temporary suspension of itself. Louis attended Mass. He met with his council. He conducted the business of the reign from his bed, when conducting it from his usual position became impossible, and the council came to him, and the ministers came to him, and the business was done. He also received visitors who were not there for business. The Duke d'Orléans came, the man who would be regent, who was already in the political calculations of the court, beginning to position himself for what came after. Louis received him with the cordiality of a man who had made his peace with the arrangements that could not be otherwise. His illegitimate children came. He had legitimized them decades earlier, given them titles and positions, integrated them into the formal structure of the court in ways that had produced resentment among the legitimate nobility, and that he had maintained, despite the resentment, because these were his children, and they existed, and pretending they did not exist was not something he was willing to do. They came to the bedside and he spoke to them. He told them things that appeared in the accounts of people who were present in the room. He told them not to imitate his love for building. He had spent too much. He told them to seek peace with their neighbors if peace was available, and to make war only when war was genuinely unavoidable, and to understand that the difference between avoidable and unavoidable was a distinction he had not always made accurately, and that the errors in the making of it had cost France more than the victories had returned. He told the young Louis, who was brought to the room, and who stood at the bedside of the great-grandfather he was about to succeed, to try to relieve the burden on the people. He said, according to the accounts that have survived, with sufficient consistency to suggest the words were genuinely spoken, do not imitate me in the taste for buildings, or in the taste for war. Try to be a peaceful prince, and let your primary goal be the welfare of your subjects. He had not done it. He knew he had not done it. He was asking the child who would follow him to do what he had not done, which is the instruction of someone who has learned something too late to apply the learning to himself. The child was 5 years old, and he stood at the bedside, and he looked at the old man dying in the bed, and he was 5 years old. What a 5-year-old understands of the gravity of such a moment is not what an adult understands. He was old enough to understand that something important was happening. He was not old enough to understand what the importance was, or what it would require of him. Louis asked to be left alone with Maintenon for a period on the afternoon of August the 25th. The court withdrew in the way that the court withdrew when such requests were made, maintaining itself just outside the boundary of the withdrawal, present without being present, aware without being visible. What happened in the room during that period is not in any record. She was there. He was there. He was dying. She had been beside him for 32 years. Whatever passed between them in that room belonged to them and has not survived as information, which is perhaps the most private thing that a man who had almost no privacy in his adult life ever managed to achieve. She left Saint-Cyr when he died, and she never returned to court. She lived 4 more years in the school she had built, working and maintaining the institution she had made. And when she died in 1719, she was buried there without ceremony, having spent her final years as far from Versailles as it was possible to be while still remaining in France. On September the 1st, 1715, at 8:15 in the morning, Louis XIV died. He had been king for 72 years and 110 days, the longest reigning monarch in the documented history of European kingship. The court began immediately the process of transitioning to the new reign. The 5-year-old great-grandchild was brought forward, and the forms of address changed, and the machinery adjusted itself to the new configuration with the smoothness that the machinery had been designed to produce. The lever happened the next morning, in Paris, when the news arrived. The reaction was not uniform, and was not what the machinery of royal image production would have wished. There were people who mourned, there were people who said nothing, and there were people, recorded in the accounts of observers who were in the city that day, who expressed something that looked like relief, which is the specific response of people who have been living under the weight of something very large for a very long time and have now been told that the weight has lifted. A man who made people feel relief at his death had made an impression that went very deep and lasted a very long time. The impression was not wrong, in the sense that the power that produced it had been real, but it was not the impression that Apollo was supposed to make. It was not the impression that the Hall of Mirrors was built to produce. It was the impression left by something very large that had stood over you for 70 years and that you had finally, on a September morning, been told was no longer there. He had wanted to be the sun. The sun does not produce relief when it sets. What Louis had produced, in the end, was something more human than that. The mixed and unresolvable response to a person who had been enormous and consequential and genuinely great in some of the ways that greatness is measured, and who had also been the source of costs that the people paying them had not been asked to agree to, and who was now gone in the way that all people are eventually gone, regardless of what they built or what they believed about the permanence of what they built. The body was placed in the carriage that would carry it to Saint-Denis, the traditional burial place of the French kings, and the carriage went north from Versailles toward Paris, and then through Paris toward the Basilica, where the kings of France had been burying themselves for centuries. The streets were not empty. People came to watch the procession, as people come to watch significant events, because the passing of something very large through the world is worth witnessing, even when you have complicated feelings about it. They watched. They were quiet. Mostly, in the way that people are quiet when they are watching something, they are still deciding what to think about. The carriage moved through them and past them and continued north. At Saint-Denis, the burial ceremonies were performed as they had always been performed, and Louis XIV was placed in the royal vault beside the kings and queens who had preceded him. He had been the longest reigning. He had been, by most measures, the most powerful. He had been, in the specific sense that he had intended, from the morning he chose to rule alone on the day after Mazarin died, the most completely himself, the least compromised by the demands of others, the most thoroughly the thing he had decided to be. The vault closed. The candles of the ceremony went out. In Versailles, a child who was 5 years old was the King of France. The sun had set. The question of what happened in the dark was just beginning. The regency began the morning after Louis died, and Philippe d'Orléans wasted no time. Within weeks of assuming control of France as regent for the 5-year-old Louis XV, he had moved the court back to Paris, reversed several of Louis's most significant governance decisions, rehabilitated people who had been disgraced under the old regime, and made clear through a series of actions that were too consistent and too rapid to be anything but planned, that the France he intended to govern would look different from the France he had inherited. The speed of the reversal tells you something important about what the reign of Louis XIV had actually been. The system that had seemed so permanent, so thoroughly embedded in the structure of French life, that it appeared to be not a system at all, but simply the way things were, turned out to be a system that a determined regent with a young king in his care could begin dismantling within months of the founding architect's death. The ceremonies did not continue in their full form. The grip that Versailles had maintained on the center of French political life relaxed. The nobles, who had been tamed by the mechanics of court attendance, gradually recovered something of their independence, because the mechanics only worked as long as someone was maintaining them, with Louis's particular combination of will and the genuine consequences that proximity to him had always carried. None of Louis's successors were Louis. This is not a criticism of them. It is a structural observation about what Louis had built and what it required to keep running. He had built a system designed around his specific qualities. His energy and his intelligence and his absolute refusal to share real power with anyone, and the genuine weight of his presence that made the calculations of everyone around him, the calculations about him specifically. When that person was gone, the system did not immediately collapse. It had too much inertia for immediate collapse. It kept going, kept performing its ceremonies, kept maintaining its hierarchy, kept organizing French public life around the presence of a king at Versailles in the way that it had always organized French public life. But it kept going, the way a very large ship keeps going after the engines stop, through momentum rather than through active propulsion. And momentum without propulsion is a temporary condition. Louis XV grew up inside the system and inherited it at the age of 13 when the regency ended. And he was not, by the accounts of people who knew him, an unintelligent or incapable man. He was intelligent. He was charming, genuinely and naturally, in ways that reminded people who were old enough to remember of the young Louis XIV. He was also a man who had grown up in a system designed to produce deference to the king rather than genuine engagement with governance. And the deferential relationship of the court to the crown had not prepared him well for the work of actually using the power that the crown concentrated. He reigned for 59 years. The achievement that matters most for understanding what Louis XIV left behind is the one that Louis XV did not accomplish, which was the structural reform of French taxation that would have addressed the fundamental problem that Colbert had identified and Vauban had documented, and that had been growing more severe with every decade of war and expenditure that Louis XIV had added to it. The problem was this: France was a country whose government spent more than it could sustainably collect in taxes, because the people who had the most money to tax were legally exempt from taxation, and the people who were taxed at levels that damaged their ability to generate the economic activity that would have produced more revenue if it had been allowed to grow unimpeded. The solution required the nobility and the clergy to give up their tax exemptions, which the nobility and the clergy were not willing to do, and which no king of France in the 18th century had the political strength to force them to do. Louis XIV had not solved this problem either. He had managed around it, using Colbert's industrial programs and the revenues from a growing economy to fund expenditures that the existing tax base could not cover, and financing the gap with borrowing when the revenues fell short. He left his successors a debt that was real, and a tax system that was still broken, and a court that was still expensive, and a nobility that was still exempt. He also left them Versailles. Versailles in the 18th century was not the strategic instrument it had been when Louis built it. The logic of its design, the idea that concentrating the nobility at court would make them politically manageable, had worked under Louis because Louis was there to make it work, to distribute the favors and withhold them and make the calculations that gave the system its power. Under his successors, Versailles became something different, a place where the nobility concentrated not because they were being politically managed, but because that was where they had always been, and where their social lives and their financial dependencies had put down roots too deep to easily pull up. The concentration without the management produced a court that was expensive and socially elaborate and politically inert in ways that made it worse than useless as a governance instrument. The nobility at Versailles were not being tamed. They were simply being there, consuming resources and performing ceremonies, and existing in a state of suspended irrelevance to the actual running of France that made them restless in ways that the ceremonies could not address. The debt grew. The wars continued, smaller and less glorious than Louis's wars, but no less expensive, eating into revenues that the broken tax system could not replenish. The gap between what the French state spent and what it could collect widened through the reign of Louis XV and into the reign of Louis XVI, who was the most unfortunate of Louis XIV's successors, in the specific sense that he was the one who happened to be sitting in the center of the system when the gap became impossible to manage. Louis XVI was not an unintelligent man. His instincts about governance were not bad, and his understanding of the problems facing France was clearer than his ability to address them. He appointed reform ministers. He tried to push through the tax reform that everyone who understood the finances knew was necessary. He was blocked, repeatedly and comprehensively, by the nobility and the clergy, whose exemptions the reform would have ended, and who had the institutional power to prevent him from ending them. And behind Louis XVI, in the understanding of the pamphlets and the people who read them, was his wife, the Austrian woman who had been sent to France at not quite 15 years old, and who had walked into the ceremonies of Versailles and tried to live inside them, and had been consumed by them in a way that Louis XIV, who had designed those ceremonies, had never anticipated and would probably not have intended. If intending anything about a woman who would not arrive at Versailles for 60 years after his death was something that made sense to say, she was not the cause of the French Revolution. That claim is too simple for the complexity of what produced the Revolution, which was the accumulated pressure of a century of fiscal mismanagement and structural inequality, and the specific intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment, and the practical demonstration provided by the American Revolution that a different arrangement of political authority was achievable, but she was the face that the Revolution needed, the face that the pamphlets had been putting on the problems of the French monarchy for years before the Revolution gave those problems their final form. She was foreign. She was female. She was associated with the extravagance of Versailles in ways that were partly her own doing and partly the doing of a system that required extravagance and that she had been placed into without being asked. Louis XIV had created Versailles. He had created the culture of display and expenditure and symbolic magnificence that Versailles represented. He had created the system in which the Queen of France was expected to dress in certain ways, and spend in certain ways, and embody the magnificence of the French crown in ways that cost real money, and that the French public, in an age when printed accounts could reach everyone, was not going to distinguish from personal extravagance. When they were looking for someone to hold responsible for their hunger, he did not create her specific choices. He did not cause her to make the decisions she made, but he built the stage on which she made them, and he built the audience's expectations of what happened on that stage. And he built the system of costs that eventually made everything on the stage untenable. The Estates General that Louis XVI convened in 1789 to address the fiscal crisis was the first meeting of that body since 1614. And 1614 was almost within Louis XIV's lifetime. France had not needed the Estates General when Louis was alive because Louis had not permitted the kind of impasse that required it. He had governed directly and completely and with enough skill to manage the contradictions in the French system without ever having to convene a body that represented constituencies he did not control. His successors were not him. They had inherited the structure without the force. They had the Versailles and the ceremonies and the debt and the broken tax system and the restless nobility and eventually the impasse that Louis himself had never reached. And when they reached it, they convened the Estates General. And the Estates General became the National Assembly. And the National Assembly became the Revolution. The Revolution did not blame Louis XIV. He had been dead for 74 years, and the Revolution was not a historical seminar. It blamed the people who were present, the king in his palace, and the queen in her apartments, and the nobility in their exemptions, and the clergy in their privileges. It blamed the system as it existed in 1789, not as it had been designed in 1661, but the system as it existed in 1789 was the system Louis XIV had built, evolved through 3 generations of successors who had maintained its form while gradually losing the force that had made the form functional. The ceremonies still happened. The lever still happened. The hierarchy of Versailles still organized itself each morning around the presence of the king. All of it still happened. And none of it worked anymore in the way it had worked when the person at the center of it was the person who had invented it. In October of 1789, the women of Paris walked 20 miles to Versailles in the rain and brought the royal family back to the city. They stood outside the gates of the palace that Louis had built specifically to be outside Paris, specifically to be a place where Paris could not follow him. And they made clear that Paris had followed. The gate that Louis had built to keep Paris out had not kept Paris out. The question of what Versailles was without the royal family inside it was answered over the following years in ways that Louis had not anticipated, because he had not designed for the possibility. After the Revolution, Versailles was opened. The palace that had been built to concentrate and control and exclude became a place that anyone could walk through, that anyone could see. Millions of people walk through it now. They walk through the Hall of Mirrors, and they stand in the rooms where the lever happened, and they look at the paintings on the ceilings and the gardens through the windows, and they try to understand what it was like to live inside this, which is a question that the palace itself makes very available and answers only partially. Because what the palace shows you is the form, the scale, the surviving surface of what was here. What it does not show you is the system beneath the surface, the machinery of attendance and hierarchy and managed favor that made the form mean what it meant. Because that machinery was made of people, and people do not survive in the way that mirrors survive. And without the machinery, the form is beautiful and large, and genuinely astonishing, and also, in some important sense, empty. Louis had filled it. With his presence and his will, and his specific and unusual capacity for sustained governance, and the genuine consequences that came with his attention, when he was gone, the filling went with him. What remained was the container, very beautiful and very expensive, and no longer functional in the way it had been built to function. He had built a world for one man. The world had been very effective for that man for 72 years. What happened to it after that man was gone is what happens to all worlds built for one man. It waited for someone who was not coming. There is an island in the middle of the Rhine where a girl went in as one person and came out as another. The girl was 15 years old, and her name, going in, was Maria Antonia. Her name, coming out, was Marie Antoinette. The island belonged to no country, and for that reason had been chosen as the place where the transfer happened, where the Austrian Archduchess was stripped of her Austrian household, and her Austrian attendants, and her Austrian dog, and her Austrian name, and was handed across to the French side of the river as a diplomatic instrument, a living seal on an alliance between two empires. She did not know, crossing that bridge, that the world she was crossing into had been designed by a man who had been dead for more than half a century. She did not know that the ceremonies she was about to encounter, the lever and the coucher and the elaborate hierarchy of who stood where, in what room, and who held what, and who was permitted to witness which moment of the Queen's daily life, had been designed by someone who had experienced their function and understood their purpose in ways that she was not yet old enough or positioned well enough to understand. She did not know about the boy who had lain in a dark room in Paris during the Fronde and decided that he would never again be in a position where someone else controlled what he did not control. She could not have known. The boy had been dead for more than 50 years when she crossed the bridge. What he had built was still there, running on the momentum of the decades he had put into its construction, maintained by people who had inherited their positions in it and who understood the forms without always understanding the purposes the forms had originally served. She walked into the forms. They consumed her in the way that forms consume people who do not understand what the forms are for, which is different from the way they consumed the people who had lived inside them when Louis was alive and when the purpose was visible in the person who had designed it. Louis had designed Versailles to tame the nobility, to make them need him, to transform their independence into dependence and their potential for rebellion into a competition for his favor. The system had worked as long as Louis was alive to operate it, because the operation required someone at the center who was genuinely formidable, who distributed and withheld favor with a skill and consistency that made the distribution and withholding feel like something more than arbitrariness. Without that person, the system kept running, but the purpose had hollowed out. The nobility still competed for position at court. The ceremonies still happened. The hierarchy still organized itself. But the competition was for position in a hierarchy that no longer connected reliably to actual power over actual things. And the ceremonies were maintaining a form whose content had been draining away for decades. Marie Antoinette was placed inside this hollowed form and was asked to inhabit it with the same conviction that Louis had inhabited it. She was not inside it thoroughly enough, and she was not positioned to understand it fully. And the result was that she appeared to the outside world, and sometimes to herself, as someone performing a role without fully comprehending the role, which in the political grammar of a country looking for explanations for its suffering was translated into something worse than incomprehension. It was translated into indifference. She was not indifferent. That is the tragedy of her position in the system Louis built. Not that she failed to care, but that the system did not provide adequate channels through which caring could be demonstrated in ways that the outside world could see, and that the channels it did provide were the channels of display and ceremony and expenditure that looked to people standing in bread lines, like the opposite of caring. Louis had built a system in which the symbol was the reality, in which what you displayed was what you were, in which the performance of magnificence was the exercise of power in his hands, with his specific capabilities. This had been true in ways that were more than merely formal. The performance had been backed by substance, and the substance had been real enough that the performance expressed something actual. By the time Marie Antoinette arrived in the system, the backing had been weakening for decades. The substance was thinner, the debt was larger. The gap between what the performance claimed and what the reality could sustain was wider than it had been at any point in Louis's own reign, and she was performing in front of an audience that had developed through the century of pamphlets and philosophical ideas and the slow penetration of new thinking about rights and governance into every level of French society. A much more sophisticated skepticism about the relationship between royal display and royal legitimacy. They were watching differently than Louis's audiences had watched. On a rainy October evening in 1789, the women of Paris arrived at the gates of Versailles after a 20-mile walk in the mud, and Marie Antoinette stepped onto the balcony to face them, and she made a deep and formal curtsy to the crowd, which had walked 20 miles to make demands rather than to offer deference, went quiet for a moment. Then someone shouted, "Long live the Queen," and others took it up. Not all of them, not with the full-throated unanimity that would have meant something unambiguous, but enough of them to create, briefly, something that was not what the walk had been about. She had done the thing that Louis had trained his entire world to do. She had made the gesture that acknowledged the people in front of her without diminishing herself in the acknowledging, and it had worked in the limited sense that the immediate moment had been navigated. But the moment was not the situation. The situation was that Versailles was no longer tenable, that the system Louis had built to keep the king safely removed from the people had become the thing that made the people feel most acutely how removed the king was, and that the distance Louis had designed as protection had become the wound. He had put 20 miles between himself and Paris because Paris had taught him, during the Fronde, that he could not trust Paris. The 20 miles had worked for his purposes because his purposes were those of a man who had the force to maintain a 20-mile distance indefinitely. His successors did not have that force. The distance remained, but the force did not, and a distance without force is not protection. It is simply a gap. The gap closed on October the 6th, 1789. The royal family returned to Paris, Versailles, emptied of the people who had given it its specific character, became something else, and then, after the revolution had run its course, became what it is now, which is a monument to what it had been. What it had been was the most complete expression in the history of the world of a single idea, which is that a nation organized entirely around one person could, under the right circumstances, and with the right person at the center, achieve things that no other form of organization could achieve. The idea was not wrong exactly. Louis had achieved things. The list of what France became under his reign is real: the expansion of French borders, the development of French industry and culture and language as dominant forces in European life, the professionalization of the French military and bureaucracy, the construction of the most imitated court in the history of the West. The things that were lost in the achieving are also real: the Huguenots and their skills and their networks, the families destroyed by 4 generations of warfare, the tax burden that accumulated on the people least able to bear it, the debt that kept growing through the reigns that followed, the structural reform that was never made, because making it would have required sharing the power that the system concentrated. Louis XIV built a sun, and it burned for 72 years, with a heat and a brilliance that no one who stood in its light ever forgot. What he did not build was a way for the sun to set gracefully. The sun does not set gradually at Versailles, withdrawing in stages, leaving the sky lighter than the night that follows. It goes, and then there is darkness, and the darkness is complete, in the way that the absence of something very bright always makes the darkness more complete than it would have been if the brightness had never existed. He had been the light, and the shadow his light cast was very long. It fell across the 18th century, and across the Revolution, and across the woman who stood on the balcony in the October rain, curtsying to the people who had walked 20 miles to reach her. And it fell across the boy who had been her son, and who died in a tower at 10 years old. And it fell across the king who had been her husband, and who died on a scaffold in January of 1793. And it fell across the France that emerged from the Revolution, and that spent the next century trying to find a form of government that could accomplish what Louis had accomplished without requiring what Louis had required. None of them were him. That was the point and the problem. Always, and simultaneously, he had begun in a dark room in Paris during the Fronde. A boy pretending to sleep while men with torches stood over him. He had built a world where that could never happen again. He had built it so thoroughly and so well that when the world began to come apart, it came apart all the way, taking with it not just the parts that were failing, but the parts that had worked. Not just the debt and the exemptions and the distance from Paris, but the ceremonies and the grandeur and the idea of France as a nation organized around a center of extraordinary human will. The center had held for 72 years, and when the center went, everything it had been holding went with it. Versailles stands today in the plain southwest of Paris. Its gardens kept in something approaching the geometric precision that Le Notre imposed on them 350 years ago. Its mirrors still reflecting the light that comes through the 17 arched windows of the gallery. The people who walk through it number in the millions each year, and they come from everywhere. Because what was built there is genuinely astonishing, and the astonishment does not require knowing the history to feel. But if you know the history, the astonishment is different. It is the astonishment of standing inside the longest sustained act of political will in the modern history of the West. Inside the physical evidence of what one person's absolute determination to control everything around him produced over 7 decades of uninterrupted effort. It is also the astonishment of standing inside something that was built to last forever and did not, that was designed to be permanent and was not, that expressed in its stone and its mirrors and its 17-acre gardens the conviction that human will, applied completely enough and for long enough, could produce something that outlasted the human who applied it. He was right that Versailles would outlast him. He was wrong that it would keep meaning what he had meant by it. That is always the mistake. Not the building. The assumption about what the building means once the builder is gone. The boy who pretended to sleep grew up to build the most magnificent palace in the history of the world. The palace is still there. The boy has been gone for 300 years. And the darkness that his light made is still part of the shape of France. It always will be. That is what it means to be the sun. The light goes everywhere. So does the shadow.